Clara Bennett didn't cry when she stepped off that train and found no one waiting for her. She stood alone on that dusty Colorado platform with 2 worn bags, a name written on a crumpled advertisement in her coat pocket, and the weight of everything she had already survived pressing down on her shoulders. She picked up both bags herself. She asked a stranger for directions. And then she started walking toward a man who had already forgotten she was coming toward a dying ranch that everyone in the county had written off, toward a life that no one believed was worth saving anymore. No one thought she would last a week. She lasted long enough to change everything. If this kind of story speaks to something in your heart, I want you to subscribe to this channel right now, hit that notification bell, and drop the name of your city in the comments below, because I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now settle in, because what Clara Bennett did next is something this frontier never forgot. The summer of 1884 arrived in Hatcher's Creek, Colorado, with the kind of heat that made men mean and land cruel. The mountains in the distance looked beautiful from the train windows, all purple shadow and snowcap, but anyone who had actually tried to work that soil knew the truth. The truth was rocks. The truth was drought. The truth was that fortunes promised by land speculators and railroad pamphlets had a way of dying slow, painful deaths somewhere between the 3rd dry season and the 4th unpaid banknote. Thomas Whitaker knew that truth better than most men alive. He had come to Colorado at 26 with his first wife Eleanor, and more hope than he had any right to carry. They had built the homestead together board by board, stone by stone, with their bare hands and borrowed money and the kind of stubborn belief that only young people and fools carry with such confidence. Eleanor had been a slight woman, quick and sharp, and she had loved the land the way some women love children fiercely privately, with a grief that cut deep when it began to fail. She died in the winter of 1881, a fever that came fast and left nothing. Thomas buried her under the cottonwood at the edge of the east field, and something in him went into that ground with her. By the summer of 1884, the homestead was a shadow of everything it had once promised to be. The chicken coop, which Eleanor had kept immaculate, had fallen into such disrepair that half the flock had wandered through gaps in the fencing and simply disappeared over the course of 2 springs. The remaining birds were thin and listless, producing eggs sporadically and without enthusiasm, as though they had picked up on the general mood of the property and decided to match it. The garden was a tangle of weeds, choking the remnants of what had once been orderly rows of beans, squash, and root vegetables. 3 of the 6 fence sections along the northern pasture had rotted through at the posts, and the cattle drifted wherever they pleased, which lately pleased them to drift toward Richard Caldwell's land, a development that gave Caldwell exactly the kind of excuse he enjoyed having. Thomas was not a lazy man. That was the thing people in town sometimes got wrong when they whispered about him at the feed store or the saloon. He was not lazy, and he was not stupid. He was simply a man who had run out of reasons to fight, and there is a particular kind of exhaustion that settles into a person when the reasons are gone. He worked every day. He rose before dawn and fell into his bed after dark. But working without direction, without hope, without any vision of what the work was building toward, that kind of labor is like pouring water into sand. It disappears and the ground stays just as dry. In April of that year, on the advice of his neighbor Walt Greer, Thomas had placed an advertisement in 3 papers, the Denver Gazette, the Kansas City Register, and a small publication out of Topeka called the Frontier Correspondence, which specialized in connecting Western settlers with practical-minded women from the East and Midwest who were seeking new beginnings. The advertisement was plain and honest, 2 qualities Thomas valued above almost all others. Rancher, 38. Colorado Mountain Territory. Homestead of 200 acres. Cattle poultry garden. Seeking capable woman, age 30 to 45, willing to work hard and share quiet life. Preference for experience in farming and animal keeping. Respond to T. Whitaker Hatcher's, Creek, Colorado. He had not mentioned Eleanor. He had not mentioned the debts. He had not mentioned that the bank had sent 2 letters in the past year that he had read once, and then placed face down on the kitchen table, where they still sat accumulating a thin layer of flour dust from the bread he occasionally managed to bake. 3 women had responded to the advertisement. The first had arrived in May, taken one look at the state of the property, asked Thomas a series of pointed questions about the debts he had conspicuously failed to mention, and boarded the next train back to Denver before supper. The second had lasted 11 days, which Thomas had briefly allowed himself to consider a kind of progress. She had been a soft-spoken widow from Nebraska who cried quietly every evening and was gone one morning without a note. The third wrote 2 letters seemed promising, and then simply stopped writing without explanation. Walt Greer told him he should put in another advertisement, this time being honest about the debts. Thomas told Walt that honesty in an advertisement would guarantee no woman ever came at all. Walt said that dishonesty was guaranteeing the same result, just with more wasted train fare. Thomas put in the advertisement again, this time to the Frontier correspondents alone, because it was the cheapest option and his finances were not accommodating extravagance. He wrote the same words, added the phrase, "honest circumstances, hard but fair life," which he felt adequately covered the situation without being specific enough to frighten anyone, and mailed it without much expectation. Clara Bennett read that advertisement on a Tuesday evening in her sister's kitchen in Lawrence, Kansas. She was 34 years old. She was a large woman, broad through the shoulders, heavy through the waist and hips, with strong hands and steady eyes, and the kind of physical presence that some people found imposing, and others found comforting, depending largely on what they needed from the world at any given moment. She had been living with her sister Margaret for 8 months, which was 6 months longer than she had intended, and approximately 7 months longer than was comfortable for either of them, though they were too fond of each other to say so directly. Clara's husband Daniel had died 2 years earlier of a lung sickness that had come on fast and gone slow, taking 18 months to finish what it started. In those 18 months, Clara had nursed him, managed their small farm outside of Lawrence, kept the books handled, the creditors sold the livestock in the right order to preserve as much as possible, and done every single thing a person could reasonably do to prevent the outcome that came anyway. The farm was gone. Daniel was gone. And Clara was left with a precise, clear-eyed accounting of exactly what she was capable of, which turned out to be considerably more than most people around her had ever bothered to notice. She was not bitter about that. She had spent a good portion of her adult life not being noticed or being noticed for the wrong things, and she had made her peace with it long before Daniel got sick. People saw the size of her before they saw anything else. They saw what they expected to see. Clara had learned early that there was a particular freedom in being underestimated, that people who don't see you clearly can't see what you're preparing to do either. She read Thomas Whitaker's advertisement twice. Then she set it down on Margaret's kitchen table and stared at the wall for a long moment. "What's that?" Margaret asked, coming in from the yard. "An advertisement," Clara said. "Colorado." Margaret looked at her with the particular expression of a woman who already knows what her sister is about to say and has complicated feelings about it. "Clara, he needs someone who can actually run a place," Clara said. "It says right here, farming, animal keeping. It says he wants a wife. That's the same thing, isn't it, in a practical sense?" "Clara, it's Colorado. You don't know this man. You don't know anything about that ranch." "I know it's 200 acres, Clara said. "I know he's got cattle and chickens and a garden and honest circumstances, whatever that means. I know he's been trying to keep something alive alone, and he's running out of time to do it." "That sounds like a description of a sinking ship." "I'm a good swimmer," Clara said. She wrote back to Thomas Whitaker the next morning. Her letter was 3 paragraphs long, direct, and contained a complete and accurate accounting of her situation, her age, her build, her history, her widowhood, her experience managing a farm, her lack of funds, and her intention if he was willing to arrive within the month. She did not apologize for any of it. She did not soften any of it. She sent it before she could talk herself out of it. Thomas wrote back in 2 weeks. His letter was 4 sentences. The last sentence said, "The train arrives at Hatcher's Creek Station on Thursdays. I will be there." He was not there. Clara stepped off the train on a Thursday in late July into heat that hit like a wall, carrying 2 bags, one with her clothes and one with 3 books, a good knife, her mother's cast-iron skillet, and a jar of starter she had been maintaining for 6 years. She stood on the platform and looked up and down the length of it twice carefully, the way she did everything. There were 7 other people on that platform. Not one of them was a man waiting for a woman he had advertised for. She waited 40 minutes because she was not a woman who drew conclusions hastily. At the end of 40 minutes, she walked to the station agent's window. "Excuse me," she said. "I'm looking for the Whitaker homestead, Thomas Whitaker. Do you know it?" The station agent, a narrow-faced man in his 40s with ink on his fingers, looked at her for a moment with the particular kind of look that Clara had been receiving her entire life. The quick assessment, the categorization, the conclusion drawn before a word was spoken. "Whitaker," he said. "Yeah, I know it. About 4 miles north. Follow the main road out of town and take the left fork past the Greer property." He paused. "You the mail order wife?" Clara held his gaze steadily. "I'm Clara Bennett," she said. "Thank you for the directions." She picked up both bags. She walked out of the station. She started walking north. The road was dry and rutted, and the heat was considerable, and Clara's bags were heavy, and 4 miles was 4 miles by any measure. She walked at a steady pace, not rushing, taking stock of what she passed, the condition of the fields, the look of the fences, the number of cattle visible in the pastures, the general state of things. By the time the Whitaker homestead came into view, she had a working picture of the county that would have taken most new arrivals weeks to develop. She had also developed a comprehensive assessment of Thomas Whitaker's character, based on the single data point of his absence from the train station. But she was reserving final judgment pending additional information. The gate to the property was open, hanging slightly off one hinge. Clara noted this. She walked through it and up the track toward the house, which was a solid enough structure, 2 stories wood-sided in need of paint, but structurally sound from what she could see. There was a barn to the left that was in worse condition, one wall visibly bowing. Behind the house, she could hear faintly the sound of chickens. Thomas Whitaker came around the corner of the barn at a run, hat in hand, face red from the sun, or embarrassment, or possibly both. He pulled up short when he saw her standing in his yard with her 2 bags and her steady gaze, and something crossed his face that she would later identify as the look of a man who has just realized he has made a mistake significant enough to require reckoning. He was tall, broad-shouldered, weathered in the way that men who worked outdoors, weathered deeply creased around the eyes, sun-darkened with hands that looked like they'd been used hard for 38 years. He was in the physical sense exactly what she'd expected from a Colorado mountain rancher. What she hadn't expected was the expression on his face, which was not the dismissive appraisal she'd been bracing for, but something closer to naked mortification. "Miss Bennett," he said. I cannot express the fence on the north pasture came down this morning and the cattle got through, and I lost track of time entirely, and by the time Walt Greer's boy rode out to remind me it was Thursday, He stopped. He put his hat back on his head and then took it off again. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I should have been there. There's no excuse that's worth offering." Clara looked at him for a moment. "Did you get the cattle back?" she asked. He blinked. "Beg pardon." "The cattle. That came through the fence this morning. Are they back in the pasture?" "Yes, ma'am. All 6 of them." "Good," she said. "Where would you like me to put my bags?" Thomas stared at her. He had clearly expected something else, tears, recrimination, the particular tight-lipped fury that he had perhaps experienced before in his dealings with women he had disappointed. What he got instead was Clara Bennett asking a practical question about luggage, and he didn't quite know what to do with that. "There's a room upstairs," he said after a moment. "Second door on the left. I cleaned it out." A pause. "Last week." "That'll do," Clara said. She picked up her bags and walked past him toward the front door. She had been inside for approximately 12 minutes, setting down her bags and conducting a preliminary inspection of the kitchen before she came back downstairs with a notebook she had taken from the bag with the books. Thomas was standing in the kitchen, uncertain whether to make coffee or start explaining himself further, when she appeared in the doorway and said, "I'd like to see the chickens." He looked at the notebook. "Now." "We're losing daylight," she said, "and I'd rather know what I'm working with before tomorrow morning." He took her to the chicken coop. She walked through it without speaking for 5 minutes, writing things down in the notebook. He watched her from the doorway, trying to read her expression and failing. "How many did you start with?" she asked without looking up. 30 hens and 2 roosters, he said. "Eleanor, my first wife, she started the flock in 78. How many now?" He hesitated. 11 hens, 1 rooster. She wrote that down. "When did the losses start?" "Gradual. 81, 82. After..." He stopped. She looked up then briefly. "After your wife died," she said. It was not a question. "Yes." She nodded and looked back at the notebook. "The feed's wrong," she said. "They need more grain. And this coop needs ventilation. They're breathing bad air, that's why their feathers look like that. The roost is too low, and there's a gap in that far corner something's been using to get in at night." She finally looked up fully. "Have you lost any to predators?" 3 or 4 over the winter," he said. "I couldn't figure out how they were getting in." "That gap," she said, pointing. "Something's been pulling the wire back. Probably a fox. You need to reset it with heavier gauge and stake it down at the base." She wrote something else in the notebook. "I'll need to see the cattle pasture and the garden before dark if you don't mind." Thomas Whitaker walked her through every corner of his failing property that evening, and for the entire 2 hours she asked questions and wrote things down and said almost nothing evaluative. She did not say, "This is a disaster," or "I can see why those other women left," or "How did you let it come to this?" She asked how deep the well ran. She asked when the north field had last been turned. She asked what his arrangement was with the feed store in town, and whether he had any credit left there or was paying cash. She asked about the cattle's grazing rotation, and whether the eastern pasture had been rested this season. By the time they walked back to the house in the blue cooling dusk, Thomas was deeply unsettled in a way he couldn't fully name. He made supper beans and cornbread, which was most of what he made, and they ate at the kitchen table across from each other, and the silence between them was not uncomfortable so much as it was weighted with things neither of them knew how to begin saying. "Well," Thomas said finally, "what do you think?" Clara set down her fork. "I think the land is fine," she said. "The cattle are thinner than they should be, but there's nothing wrong with them that good management won't fix. The chicken flock is small, but you've still got 1 good rooster and 11 hens, and that's enough to rebuild from. The garden's been neglected, but the soil isn't dead, it just needs work." She picked her fork back up. "What I think is that you've been trying to keep too many things going alone for too long, and without a system, the effort just runs off everywhere, like water on hard ground, and you've got nothing to show for it at the end of the day." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "And what would you do about that?" he said. If you decided to stay." The words were careful. They both heard the if. "I'd start with the chickens," Clara said, "because that's the fastest return. Fix the coop, change the feed, close that gap. Give it 30 days and you'll have eggs you can sell in town. That's cash, and cash is what gives you time to work on everything else." She considered. "I'd rotate the cattle to the south pasture for the rest of the summer and let the east field rest. Come fall, we plow the east field and put it into winter wheat. I've seen the prices, and wheat makes more sense for this elevation than corn." Thomas stared at her. "We," he said. She met his eyes. "That's a question, is it?" "I suppose it is." "I came here with 2 bags and no plan to go back," Clara said. "I've been running a farm since I was 14 years old. I'm not sentimental about hard work, and I'm not frightened of hard winters. But I need to know that what I tell you about this place will be heard. I'm not looking for someone to take my suggestions under consideration. I'm looking for a partnership." Something moved in Thomas Whitaker's face that she hadn't seen there before. It wasn't the mortification from the yard, and it wasn't the careful uncertainty of a man sizing up a stranger. It was something older than either of those, something that looked, if she was reading it right, very much like relief. "Miss Bennett," he said, "the truth is, I'm 2 payments behind on the banknote, and Richard Caldwell has already come by twice to ask if I'm ready to discuss terms. The truth is, I don't know if there's enough here to save." He paused. I didn't put that in the advertisement." "No," she said, "you didn't." "If you'd known, I'd have come anyway," she said, "because the question isn't whether it can be saved. The question is whether the person I'm partnering with is willing to do what saving it requires. That's all I need to know." Thomas was quiet for a long time. Outside, the first crickets of the evening started up, and somewhere in the barn an owl had taken up residence and was making its presence known. "What is it you want?" he asked finally. "From this, if it works." Clara thought about that. "I want to be useful," she said. "I want to build something. I want—" She stopped, and something briefly crossed her face, something that was not grief exactly, but was adjacent to it. "I spent 2 years watching something fall apart, and I couldn't stop it no matter what I did. I want to be somewhere I can make a difference. Somewhere the work matters." She looked at him directly. "That's what I want." He nodded slowly. "That's honest," he said. "I'm always honest," she said, "even when it's inconvenient." The next morning, Clara was up before Thomas. He came downstairs at first light to find coffee already made, her notebook open on the table, and a list written in her clear, firm hand. 12 items long, numbered specific, and ordered by urgency. He stood in the kitchen doorway reading it for a full minute. When she came in from the yard where she had already been to check the chickens, he looked up from the list. "You wrote all this morning," he said. "Couldn't sleep," she said. "The rooster's louder than I expected." He looked back at the list. Item 1 was close the coop gap before nightfall today, Fox. Item 2 was calculate current feed cost versus egg yield and determine whether to increase flock or wait. Item 4 was speak to the feed store about credit terms. Item 8 was locate and review bank correspondence, both letters. Thomas set the list back on the table. "How did you know about 2 letters?" he said. Clara poured herself coffee. "Because there were 2 envelopes on the table with the bank's name on them, and both were face down," she said. "Which means you read them and didn't want to read them again. Which means there's a deadline in at least one of them." She sat down across from him. "What does the second one say?" He was quiet for a long moment. Then he crossed to the table, picked up both envelopes, and handed them to her. The first letter was a standard notice of arrears, 2 missed payments, total of $68. Serious, but not yet catastrophic. The second letter was shorter and considerably more pointed. The bank was prepared to initiate foreclosure proceedings within 90 days if the account was not brought current or alternative arrangements were not made. Clara read both letters twice. She set them down and picked up her coffee. 90 days, she said. 90 days? Thomas agreed. "That's enough time," she said. He looked at her. "Is it, not to pay it off," she said, "but enough to show the bank that this place is viable? Enough to change the conversation from when do we foreclose to when does he catch up? Banks prefer a paying borrower to a foreclosed property. They always have." She turned the second letter over and began writing on the back of it. "I need to know your total expenses, your total income from last year, and every creditor you have besides the bank." Thomas looked at the letter she was writing on and had a brief, complicated feeling about watching a woman use his foreclosure notice as scratch paper, but he found he couldn't identify the feeling as anything close to objection. "I'll get the ledger," he said. What Clara found in that ledger was not quite as bad as she had feared, which itself told her something that she had been bracing for the worst, and Thomas had somehow managed to hold something together even through 3 years of grief and diminishing hope. The debt was real, and the income was genuinely insufficient, but there was no mystery about what had gone wrong. The chickens alone, restored to the original flock size and managed properly, could generate $8 to $12 a month in egg sales. The garden, if brought back to productivity, reduced his cash food expenditure and freed up money for other needs. The cattle, if managed to prevent the ongoing drift and damage to Caldwell's fences, eliminated a source of conflict that Clara already understood was costing him more than just money. She spent the first week largely silent, observing and working. She fixed the coop gap the first morning, Thomas watching, as she cut and reset the wire herself, rather than waiting for him, and moved the chickens to better feed within 3 days. She pulled weeds in the garden every evening after supper. She made 2 trips to town, one to speak to the feed store about credit, which she secured by explaining the situation with a directness that apparently caught the store owner off guard enough that he agreed, and one to introduce herself to the banker who had sent the letters, a man named Henderson, who she spoke with for 30 minutes, and who emerged from the conversation looking thoughtful rather than dismissive, which was the outcome she had aimed for. Thomas didn't ask what she said to Henderson, but that evening he asked carefully if it had gone well. He agreed to 60 days without further action, Clara said, in exchange for a written accounting of the plan to bring the account current. I'll write it this week. Thomas looked at her for a long moment. You negotiated with the bank, he said. Yes. How did you? I told him the truth, Clara said. That the property is viable, that the management problems are being addressed, and that a foreclosure on a 200-acre working ranch in the current market would take him at least 8 months to resolve and cost him more than waiting for us to catch up. She considered. I also told him I had 6 years of farm management experience and that I intended to stay. The words landed differently than she'd meant them to, maybe. Thomas didn't say anything for a moment, and then he said quietly, Did you mean that you intended to stay? I said it, didn't I? Clara said. I told you, I'm always honest, even when it's inconvenient. He nodded. He looked down at the table, and then, without making much of it, he reached across and set his hand briefly over hers, just for a second, just the lightest possible press of acknowledgement, and then pulled it back and picked up his coffee cup. Clara kept her expression exactly as it was, but she noted it. She noted it very carefully. The first person from town to come out to the Whitaker property after Clara arrived was Walt Greer, who came on the pretext of returning a borrowed tool, but whose actual purpose was clearly reconnaissance. He was a solid, plain-faced man about Thomas's age, and he was polite in the way that genuinely decent men are polite without thinking about it as a matter of course. He shook Clara's hand when Thomas introduced them, and he said, "Ma'am," and looked at her face rather than letting his gaze travel, which she appreciated. The second visitor was less welcome. Richard Caldwell came on a Friday morning 10 days after Clara's arrival, and he came on horseback with a hand riding behind him, which Clara recognized as the kind of approach designed to communicate something without saying it directly. Caldwell was a large man, well-dressed by frontier standards, somewhere in his mid-50s, with a face that had the look of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted and mildly interested by the rare occasions when this did not occur. He dismounted at the gate with the ease of a man making himself comfortable on someone else's property, and he walked up to where Thomas and Clara were standing in the yard without being invited to do so. "Whitaker," he said. And then he looked at Clara, not with the blunt assessment of the station agent, but with the particular measuring look of a man calculating an obstacle. This must be the new wife. "Clara Bennett," Clara said. She did not extend her hand. She had decided in the first half-second of Caldwell's approach that she was not going to perform warmth she didn't feel, and Caldwell was a man who would read, offered warmth as a sign of weakness regardless. "Richard Caldwell," he said. "I own the CCC east and north of here. Thomas and I go back a ways." He smiled the kind of smile that is applied rather than felt. "Came by to welcome you to the county, and to see how things were progressing." "That's neighborly of you," Clara said. Something shifted slightly in Caldwell's expression. A fractional recalibration, the adjustment of a man who had expected a slightly different kind of woman. "Indeed," he said. He looked at Thomas. "I heard you had some trouble with Henderson at the bank. I wanted you to know my offer still stands, Thomas. Whenever you're ready to have a real conversation about the property." Thomas's jaw tightened. "I appreciate that, Richard," he said in a tone that did not sound appreciative. "No pressure," Caldwell said easily. "But you know the way these things go. Sooner is generally better than later, and the longer a property sits in arrears, the less leverage the seller has." "The property isn't in default," Clara said. Caldwell looked at her. Beg pardon? The note is in arrears, Clara said. That's not the same thing as default, and we have an agreement with Mr. Henderson that takes foreclosure off the table for the immediate term. I'm sure you know the difference, Mr. Caldwell. She kept her voice pleasant. But I appreciate you clarifying that you have an interest in the property. It's useful information. There was a brief silence. Behind Caldwell, his hand shifted slightly in the saddle, and the horse stamped one foot. You're a practical woman, Caldwell said finally. I am, Clara agreed. I imagine Thomas is glad to have the help. The word help was placed with care doing work. We're partners, Thomas said, and his voice was steadier than Clara would have expected, given the look on his face 3 seconds earlier. He didn't look at her when he said it. He kept his eyes on Caldwell. That's what I'd call it. Caldwell looked between the two of them and did another recalibration, this one slightly less subtle. Well, he said. Welcome to Hatcher's Creek, Miss Bennett. I'm sure we'll have occasion to talk more. He turned back to Thomas. My offer remains open, Thomas. You know where to find me. He remounted with the smooth ease of a man who rides well and knows it, and turned and rode back toward the gate with his hand falling in behind him. Thomas and Clara stood in the yard until the sound of hooves faded. He's been waiting 2 years, Thomas said. I know, Clara said. He's got money, and he's got patience, and he's got friends at the bank, Thomas said. I know that too, Clara said. She turned and started back toward the house. We'd better get the chickens sorted before supper. I want to count the eggs this week and see where we are. Thomas stood there for another second looking at the empty gate. Then he turned and followed her. 3 weeks after Clara's arrival, the first eggs went into town. 14 dozen packed carefully in straw in the back of Thomas's wagon, addressed to 3 buyers Clara had identified through conversations at the feed store and a church social she had attended, not for the religion she told Thomas plainly, but for the information gathering. The buyers were a restaurant, a hotel kitchen, and a housewife 2 streets over who had been buying from a supplier in the next county and was unhappy about the freshness. She sold all 14 dozen at a price 10 cents per dozen higher than Thomas had ever managed to get, because she had brought 2 of the hens into town in a crate and let the restaurant owner see them personally, which established that the eggs were coming from healthy birds and not the half-dead chickens that gave the Whitaker name its current reputation in town. Thomas looked at the money when she put it in his hand that evening. That's more than I've made off those chickens in 2 years, he said. That's because you were selling a product without selling the story behind it, Clara said. People in town know this ranch has been struggling. You have to give them a reason to believe in the product before they'll pay a fair price for it. She sat down at the table. Next month, we'll have enough eggs to add 2 more buyers. By October, if we bring the flock up to 25 hens, we can think about selling to the mercantile as well. Thomas sat down across from her, and he was looking at her in the particular way he had started looking at her in the past week. Not the careful uncertainty of the first days, but something more direct, something that had enough weight to it that Clara had started noticing when it happened, and then noticing that she was noticing, which was its own kind of information. Clara, he said. Yes, I owe you an apology, he said. Not just for the train station, though that stands on its own, but for... He paused. When I put that advertisement in, I told Walt Greer I just needed someone sensible who could help keep the place from falling apart completely. Someone who could manage the house and the animals. I wasn't... He stopped again. I wasn't thinking about partnership. I wasn't thinking about what I was asking for when I asked for a wife. I was thinking about help, Clara said. Not unkindly. About someone who would stay, he said. That was the honest truth of it. I just needed someone who would stay. He looked at his hands. I didn't expect... He didn't finish the sentence. Clara waited. You're the most capable person I've ever had on this property, he said finally, including myself, and I've been working it for 12 years. Clara was quiet for a moment. I'm a farmer, she said at last. It's what I know. It's what I've always been. It's more than that, Thomas said. You walked 4 miles in July heat with 2 bags, and you walked in that gate and you didn't say one word about the condition of anything. You started working. I figured talking about what was wrong wouldn't fix it, Clara said. Most people talk, he said. Most people see something failing, and they talk about how it's failing. He made a gesture that indicated the whole of the past 3 weeks. You just started. Clara looked at him steadily. Thomas, she said, I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to answer me honestly. All right, he said. Do you intend to let me do this work? She said. Not tolerate it, not watch it with appreciation and then override it when you disagree. But actually partner with me, hear what I say about this land, and take it seriously, even when it contradicts what you've been doing. Thomas held her gaze. Yes, he said. That's what I intend. Because if Caldwell comes back, she said, and he will come back, I need to know that when I make decisions to protect this property, you'll stand behind them, even if the method is different from what you'd choose. He will come back, Thomas agreed. I know, she said. And when he does, I want us to be ready, not just the finances. I want the whole county to know this homestead is producing. I want the restaurant owner and the hotel kitchen and Mrs. Alderman on Birch Street all talking about where their eggs come from. I want Caldwell to come back and find that the market for what we're building here has already been established and can't be undone by a foreclosure sale. Thomas looked at her for a long moment. You've been thinking about this since before he showed up, he said. I've been thinking about it since I read your advertisement, Clara said. A struggling homestead with a hostile neighbor who has money and patience. That's not a financial problem. That's a strategy problem. And strategy is something I'm good at. Outside, the summer dark was settling in, and the first stars were appearing above the mountains, and the owl in the barn was starting up again. Thomas looked at Clara across the kitchen table, at the notebook she had set aside, at the careful, steady expression she wore, the way some people wear armor at the hands, that had already in 3 weeks fixed more on this property than he had managed to fix in 2 years alone, and he felt for the first time in 3 years the particular sensation of being somewhere that might actually become a future. What do you need, he said, to do this right? What do you need from me? Clara thought about it honestly for a moment. I need you to stop apologizing for the condition of this place when people come by, she said. That's the first thing. Every time you apologize for it, you're telling people it's as bad as they think. Stop apologizing. Start describing what it's becoming. All right, he said. I need you to back me up with Henderson at the bank. Go in with me next week and let me do the talking, but stand beside me when I do it. I can do that. And I need... She paused. This one was harder to say somehow. I need you to tell me about Eleanor. Not everything, and not now. But she built those chickens, and she started that garden, and she's in this land whether we acknowledge her or not. I'd rather honor what she built than pretend it was always like this. Something happened in Thomas's face then that was not grief exactly, or if it was grief, it was the kind that doesn't break a person, the kind that has been sitting long enough to become something more like a stone in the chest, heavy but no longer sharp. She would have liked you, he said quietly. That's a kind thing to say, Clara said. It's the truth, he said. She was practical. She didn't suffer fools, and she would have seen exactly what I see. He looked at his hands. She would have told me I was a fool to have been managing things the way I have been. You weren't managing things poorly, Clara said. You were managing them alone. That's different. Thomas looked up at her. In the lamplight, with the sounds of the Colorado night outside, and the weight of the past 3 years sitting somewhere behind his eyes, he looked like what he was, a man who had been trying his best and coming up short for long enough that he had forgotten what trying and succeeding felt like. Stay, he said. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a request quite either. It was somewhere between those things a word said, as though it were the most important word left in his vocabulary. Clara looked at him for a long moment. I walked 4 miles in July heat to get here, she said. I'm not going anywhere, and somewhere in the dark outside in the coop, with its newly closed gap and its better feed, and its 11 hens and one good rooster, who had started crowing with something that sounded improbably like confidence. The small and stubborn beginnings of something were already taking root. The rooster crowed at 4:30 that first morning, after Thomas said stay, and Clara was already awake when it happened, lying in the upstairs room with the ceiling she hadn't looked at yet, and the window she hadn't opened, running numbers in her head, the way she had run numbers for the past 3 weeks. Feed costs against egg yield, labor time, against output, debt service against what was realistically achievable in 90 days, and what was achievable in 60, and what was achievable in 30, if everything went exactly right, which it never did. But you had to start somewhere. She got up dressed and went downstairs before Thomas stirred. The ledger was on the table where she'd left it. She opened it to the page she'd been working on the night before and looked at the column of numbers she'd written in the margin. The parallel accounting she'd been running alongside Thomas's original entries, not to correct him, but to see the shape of the thing. Clearly, the way a doctor reads a chart. Not to argue with the patient's experience of being sick, but to understand what the sickness actually is. The shape of it was this. The homestead was losing approximately $40 a year, which wasn't ruinous in isolation, but became ruinous when you added $68 in arrears and a 90-day clock that had already ticked down to 67 days, and a neighbor who was watching the property the way a man watches a card game he expects to win. $40 a year. She'd been thinking about that number all night, because $40 a year lost was $12 a month lost, and $12 a month lost was $3 a week, and $3 a week was a gap that a productive chicken flock, a functioning garden, and one good idea could close. The numbers weren't the problem. The numbers were almost manageable. What hadn't been manageable for 3 years was having someone in that house who could see that. She heard Thomas on the stairs at 5, and she had coffee ready when he came through the kitchen doorway, and he stopped and looked at the ledger open on the table, and the coffee waiting, and her sitting there with her notebook, and something crossed his face that she was starting to recognize. A kind of quick recalibration. The expression of a man who keeps expecting to come downstairs and find the situation one way and keeps finding it different. "You been up long," he said. "A while," she said. "Sit down. I want to show you something." He sat. She turned the ledger to face him and put her finger on the column she'd written in the margin. "This is what we're actually losing," she said. "Not what the bank sees. What we're actually losing month by month when you account for the feed cost that's too high, and the egg income that's too low, and the garden that's producing maybe 30% of what it should." Thomas looked at the numbers. His jaw worked slightly the way it did when he was processing something he didn't entirely want to process. "That doesn't look as bad as I expected," he said carefully. "It's not," she said. "That's what I'm telling you. This place isn't dying because it's broken past fixing. It's dying because the margin is thin and the management hasn't been able to close the gap." She tapped the page. "We close this gap, the bank conversation changes. Henderson's not an unreasonable man. He gave us 60 days because he could see it was possible. I want to walk back in there in 30 days, with actual numbers, not promises." Thomas looked at her across the table. "You're thinking we go back in 30 days. I'm thinking we go back in 30 days with a month of egg receipts and a revised projections sheet and the beginning of the fall planting schedule," Clara said. "I'm thinking we show him the trajectory, not just the current state. Banks don't foreclose on a trajectory. They foreclose on stagnation." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Where'd you learn to think like this?" "Watching my farm disappear," she said flatly. "I spent 2 years trying to save something and not knowing how to talk to the people who had the power to let me try. I'm not making that mistake twice." Thomas looked at his coffee. Then he said quietly, "I'm sorry you had to go through that." "Don't be sorry," Clara said. "Be useful. Now, tell me about the Caldwell fence line." "His property runs along our north and east borders." The shift was deliberate, and Thomas recognized it as such the way she moved away from anything that required either of them to sit with feeling for too long. Not because she was cold, but because there was work to do, and work was the language they both trusted more than most others right now. He accepted the shift, and they spent the next hour at the table going over the property boundaries, the history of the fence disputes, and every interaction Thomas had documented with Caldwell over the past 2 years, which turned out to be more than Clara had expected. "He's been building a case," she said when Thomas finished. "What do you mean?" "Every time your cattle drifted onto his land, did he document it?" Thomas frowned. "He sent letters, a few of them." "To you or to the county land office?" A pause, a longer one than she liked. "I don't know," he said. "We need to find out," she said. "Today if possible." "Clara, the land office is in Millbrook. That's 12 miles. "Then we should leave soon," she said. Thomas stared at her. "You want to ride to Millbrook today?" "I want to know if Richard Caldwell has been filing formal complaints against this property before he shows up again with another offer," she said. "Because if he has, that changes what we're dealing with. That's not a neighbor making opportunistic offers. That's a man building legal groundwork." She stood up and took her coffee cup to the basin. "Do we have a horse I can ride, or do we take the wagon?" They took the wagon because Clara had not ridden in 2 years and said so plainly, and Thomas had not argued, which she noted. The ride to Millbrook gave them 2.5 hours in each direction, and it was the longest sustained conversation they had managed since her arrival. Not about the ranch, or not only about the ranch, but the kind of conversation that happens between two careful people when they are placed in proximity with nowhere else to look and nothing pressing to manage. She told him about Daniel. Not everything, but enough: the sickness, the farm, the specific particular exhaustion of watching something you love diminish gradually over a long time. Thomas listened without offering comfort, which was the right thing to do, and she noticed that too. He told her about Eleanor, about how she had planted the first garden in the spring of 1879, with seeds she'd carried all the way from Ohio, how she had known the name of every chicken in the original flock, how she had laughed at Thomas when he tried to learn to cook after her first winter illness, and produced something that he called biscuits and she called something considerably less polite. Clara smiled at that genuinely, and Thomas looked at her sideways when she did quickly, as though checking to see if the smile was real. It was real. He seemed to understand that. What Clara found at the Millbrook land office was worse than she'd feared and better than her worst case. Caldwell had filed 3 formal complaints over the past 18 months, all regarding cattle trespass, all with dates and estimated damages, all submitted with the kind of careful paperwork that suggested either Caldwell himself had legal experience or he was paying someone who did. The complaints were legitimate, which was the part that wasn't better. What was better was that none of them had been escalated, which meant the land office clerk, a young man named Abbott, who seemed to find the whole situation more interesting than he should have told her, that without a formal response from the property owner, the complaints just sat. "What happens if they keep sitting?" Clara asked. Abbott looked at his desk. "After a certain period, the complainant can petition for a hearing," he said. "That's usually." He checked a ledger. "Usually about 2 years from the first filing. The first one here is dated March of last year." "March of last year," Clara said. "So 9 months. "Give or take," Abbott said. Thomas, standing beside her, said nothing. His expression was doing something complicated. Clara looked at the 3 complaint documents and asked Abbott if she could have copies. He obliged with the slightly dazzled efficiency of a man who is not accustomed to women arriving to conduct land office business with the focused energy of a lawyer with a court date. On the wagon ride back, Thomas was quiet for a long time. Then he said, 9 months. 9 months before he can file for a hearing, Clara said. Which means if he wants to use those complaints as additional pressure to force a sale, he's working with a timeline. He needs you to sell before then, because after that, the complaints become a separate process and a more complicated one. So the bank foreclosure and the land complaints are probably coordinated, Clara said. He's patient, you said it yourself. He's been building 2 different paths to the same door. The question is which one he's planning to use as the primary approach. Thomas said nothing for a while. Then very quietly, I didn't know any of this. I know, Clara said, not unkindly. I should have gone to the land office myself. Yes, she said, but you didn't, and now we know, and now we can do something about it. She pulled the copies of the complaints from her bag and looked at them again. The cattle trespass is real. We can't dispute that. But we can respond to the complaints formally, which starts the official response clock and prevents him from using them quietly without your knowledge, and we can fix the north fence. The north fence posts are rotted through, Thomas said. That's a week's work at minimum, and I don't have the lumber. What does lumber cost at the Millbrook yard? He told her. She calculated in her head for a moment. We can cover it with the next 2 egg payments, she said. We start the fence the week after. Thomas looked at her. The late afternoon light was going golden and long across the Colorado Road, and there was dust rising from the wagon wheels, and somewhere behind them a hawk was making lazy circles, and Thomas Whitaker was looking at Clara Bennett with an expression she had not seen on his face before, something raw and entirely undefended. Clara, he said, why are you doing this? She looked at him directly. Doing what? All of it. The land office, the bank, the fence, the chickens. A pause. Me. She considered her answer for a moment, because she was not a woman who gave unconsidered answers to important questions. Because it's worth doing, she said. Because this land is worth saving, and you're worth helping, and I have the ability to do both. She looked back at the road. And because I'm tired of watching things fail that didn't have to. He didn't say anything else, but he moved slightly on the wagon seat, and his shoulder was against hers, and neither of them moved away. The formal response to Caldwell's land office complaints was 3 pages long, written in Clara's firm, clear hand, citing the relevant territorial statutes that she had asked Abbott to point her toward before they left Millbrook. Thomas signed it. Clara rode back to Millbrook alone 2 days later to file it because Thomas had cattle to manage, and the look on Abbott's face when she reappeared at his window was almost worth the 24 miles. What she didn't expect was Richard Caldwell being in Millbrook that same day. She saw him coming out of the bank as she came out of the land office, and for a half second their eyes met across the width of the main street, and she could see the moment he recognized her, and the moment he registered what building she had just exited. He walked toward her. She stood still and waited. Miss Bennett, he said. His tone was pleasant. His eyes were not. Mr. Caldwell, she said. Business at the land office, he said. Routine filing, she said. Property documentation. She smiled pleasantly. You know how it is. A new partner on a property there are always administrative matters to attend to. The word partner landed exactly where she meant it to. Indeed, Caldwell said. His jaw was doing something careful. Thomas is lucky to have such a thorough helpmate. We're partners, Clara said. The same word Thomas had used. She meant it the same way. I'll tell him you said hello, Mr. Caldwell. She turned and walked to where she'd tied the horse, and she did not look back, and her hands were entirely steady, and it was only when she was 2 miles out of Millbrook on the road back toward Hatcher's Creek that she let out a long, slow breath and permitted herself to feel how much that had cost her. She was not frightened of Richard Caldwell, but she was not foolish about him either. A man with money and patience and a plan was not stopped by paperwork. He was slowed by it. And a man who was slowed was a man who was looking for another angle, and she needed to know what angle that was before he found it. She got back to the homestead in the late afternoon and found Thomas in the yard with Walt Greer, who was holding his hat in his hands with the look of a man who has just delivered unpleasant news. She read the situation in the half-second it took her to dismount. What happened? She said. Thomas turned. The hotel kitchen canceled, he said. The egg order. Margaret Dillon over at the Hatcher's Creek Hotel, she sent word this morning. Said she was going back to her previous supplier. Walt Greer turned his hat in his hands. Her previous supplier is Caldwell's brother-in-law, he said somewhat apologetically. He runs a farm east of here. Clara stood still for a moment, 36 dozen eggs a month gone. Gone not because the eggs were inferior, she knew they weren't. She had watched Margaret Dillon's cook practically glow over the yolks 3 weeks ago, but gone because Richard Caldwell had made a phone call or sent a letter and reminded his brother-in-law that there was a favor owed. "All right," she said. Thomas looked at her. "Clara, he's telling us something," she said. "He can reach our buyers, which means we need buyers he can't reach." She handed the horse's reins to Walt without looking at him. "Walt, do you know anyone in Millbrook who buys eggs regularly, not through a local supplier?" Walt blinked. "There's the Millbrook Hotel," he said slowly. "They're bigger than the Hatcher's Creek one, and the school they've been talking about a regular food supplier since the new schoolmaster came. And," he thought, "there's a women's auxiliary that meets Thursdays. They do big suppers for the church. They'd go through a lot of eggs." "Good," Clara said. She was already walking toward the house. "Thomas, can we get to Millbrook by Thursday morning?" "Clara." His voice stopped her at the door. She turned. He was looking at her with something in his face that was tangled up between admiration and concern, and something else she wasn't ready to name. "He's going to keep doing this," he said. "Every buyer we find." "He can't reach all of them," she said. "He's got relationships in this county, but he's not the only man with relationships. We find enough buyers and spread them wide enough, and he can't pull them all." She met his eyes. "But I need you to trust me on this. I know it feels like we're fighting a losing battle. We're not. We're fighting a slow one. That's different." Thomas held her gaze for a long moment. Walt was extremely interested in the middle distance. "I trust you," Thomas said. She turned and went inside, and she sat down at the kitchen table, and she opened her notebook, and she did not let herself think about how much she had needed to hear those 3 words until much later that night, when the house was quiet and the figures in the ledger blurred slightly, and she had to blink twice before they came clear again. Thursday's trip to Millbrook produced the school supply contract, which was small but steady. 2 dozen eggs a week, paid monthly. With the new schoolmaster, a precise young man from Pennsylvania named Morrison, who seemed both surprised and impressed that Clara had come to speak to him personally. It also produced an introduction to a woman named Helen Vance, who ran the Women's Auxiliary, and who within 40 minutes of meeting Clara had agreed to a standing monthly order, and also appeared to be extremely interested in Clara's opinions about the Territorial Council's recent positions on water rights, which Clara had not previously considered herself to have opinions about, but found in the course of the conversation that she did. Helen Vance was 60, broad, sharp-eyed, and had the particular bearing of a woman who had been underestimated enough times to have developed a permanent mild amusement about it. She shook Clara's hand at the end of their conversation and held it a moment. "You're new to this county," she said. "About 5 weeks," Clara said. "And you're already in the land office, and the school office, and my parlor," Helen said not disapprovingly. "Where'd you come from?" "Kansas," Clara said. Helen Vance smiled. "Good," she said. "This county could use more Kansas." On the ride back, Thomas said, "You know she's on the county board of trustees." "I know," Clara said. "Did you know that before you went in there?" "No," she said. "But I'm glad I do now." Thomas shook his head slowly in the way of a man who is becoming accustomed to being impressed and is still not entirely sure how to carry it. "Walt Greer told me this morning. He said that half the town is talking about you." "Good things or bad things?" Clara said. "Walt says it's approximately even," Thomas said. "The feed store owner thinks you're the most organized person to come through the county in 10 years. A few of the older ranchers think it's strange a woman running the business side of a homestead. And apparently someone told someone that you went to the land office over the Caldwell complaints, and Caldwell himself is—" He paused. Walt's word was unsettled. "Good," Clara said. "Clara, unsettled men make mistakes," Thomas said. "But they also make moves." She looked at him. "I know," she said. "That's why I want him unsettled. A man who's comfortable waits. A man who's unsettled acts. And when he acts, we'll see what he's actually got." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "You're not afraid of him at all, are you?" he said. It was not quite a question. She thought about that honestly. "I'm afraid of losing this place," she said. "I'm afraid of coming this far and doing this much and then watching it go to a man who wants it for all the wrong reasons." She paused. "But Caldwell himself, no. I've met Richard Caldwell before. Different name, different county, same plan. Men like him count on people being too tired or too frightened to pay attention. I'm not tired yet, and I don't frighten easy." She looked at him. "Does that bother you?" Thomas said, "It's the most reassuring thing anyone has said to me in 3 years." And his voice was rough at the edges, in a way that had nothing to do with the dust on the road. The move came on a Wednesday 11 days later, and it didn't come from the direction she was watching. It came from the bank. Thomas came in from the pasture at mid-morning, and his face was the color of old ash, and he had a letter in his hand that had not been there when he left the house 2 hours earlier. He sat down at the table and put the letter in front of Clara and didn't say anything. She read it. Henderson at the bank was no longer the relevant party. The note on the Whitaker homestead had been sold, transferred. The new holder of the debt was a holding company out of Denver called the Meridian Land Trust, and the Meridian Land Trust had reviewed the account and determined that the existing arrangement was insufficient, and the Meridian Land Trust was exercising its contractual right to call the note in full. Full payment due in 45 days. All $68 in arrears, plus the outstanding principal on the note. Total due, $412. Clara read the letter once. Then she read it again. Then she set it down on the table. "Henderson sold the note," Thomas said. His voice was entirely flat. "He said he wouldn't—" "Henderson didn't decide this," Clara said. "Henderson was probably approached by someone who made him an offer on the note. Notes get sold. It's not illegal." She looked at the letter again. "Meridian Land Trust. Do you know who that is?" Thomas shook his head. "I do," she said. "Or I can find out." She stood up. "Get the wagon. We're going to Millbrook." "Clara, it's Wednesday. The land office isn't—" "We're not going to the land office," she said. "We're going to find out who the Meridian Land Trust is and who is behind it." She picked up her coat and her notebook. "Because I'll give you very good odds that if we pull on that thread, we find Richard Caldwell on the other end of it." She was right. It took Helen Vance's connections at the county recorder's office and approximately 4 hours of digging through incorporation records that the county recorder was initially reluctant to produce, until Helen Vance looked at him with a particular expression that Clara suspected had been making county officials cooperative for about 20 years, but by mid-afternoon, they had it. The Meridian Land Trust had 3 principals. 2 of them were Denver businessmen Clara had never heard of. The third was a man named Gerald Marsh, who was Richard Caldwell's son-in-law. Thomas read the name twice. Then he set the paper down. "He bought the note," he said. "He bought our note through a holding company." "So he could call it?" Clara said. "And call it fast before we had time to build enough runway to survive it." $412 in 45 days, Thomas said. "Clara, we don't—" "I know what we have," she said. "I know exactly what we have." She was looking out the window of Helen Vance's parlor, where Helen had tactfully absented herself to make tea. "We have $70 in the egg account. We have the fall wheat that won't yield until November. We have the cattle which we could sell, but selling the cattle guts the long-term viability of the place, and Caldwell knows that." She turned around. "He's got us in a corner." Thomas looked at her. In all the weeks since her arrival, through every piece of bad news and every setback and every Caldwell visit and every problem she had methodically dismantled and rebuilt, she had never once used the words "in a corner." He felt the weight of those words in a way he hadn't felt anything in a long time. "Clara," he said very quietly, "is this—" He stopped, started again. "Is this the part where it's not salvageable?" She looked at him for a long moment. And then something shifted in her expression. Not the careful steadiness he had come to rely on, but something underneath it. Something that was not defeat and was not false hope, but was the most honest thing he had seen on her face since she walked through his gate. "No," she said. "It's not." She picked up her notebook. "But I need to think. Give me tonight. Don't say anything to Walt. Don't say anything to anyone, and tomorrow morning I'll tell you what I figured out." Thomas looked at her for another long moment. Then he said simply, "All right." Helen Vance came back in with the tea, and she looked at both of their faces, and she set the tea tray down and she said, "Tell me." And Clara, after a brief assessment of Helen Vance and everything she had observed about her in the past 11 days, made a decision. She told her. Helen listened without interrupting for a full 10 minutes. When Clara finished, there was a silence in the parlor that had particular texture to it, the silence of a woman who is not just thinking, but assembling. "Meridian Land Trust," Helen said. "Gerald Marsh." "You know him," Clara said. "I know of him," Helen said. "He had a dispute with the Territorial Council 2 years ago over a water rights claim that didn't go the way he wanted. He lost." She looked at Clara. "And Richard Caldwell testified against him at that hearing." Clara went very still. Thomas looked between the two women. "Wait," he said. "Caldwell testified against his own son-in-law. The water rights dispute was before Marsh married Caldwell's daughter," Helen said. "They've since made their peace, obviously, but—" She paused. "The point is that Gerald Marsh has a particular history with transactions that are not entirely straightforward, and the Territorial Council's Land Affairs Committee is very interested in any entity that appears to be acquiring properties through indirect pressure." Clara looked at her. "You're on that committee," she said. "I chair that committee," Helen Vance said and smiled. The room was quiet for a moment. Outside, the Colorado evening was going blue and cool, and somewhere down the street a dog was barking, and inside Helen Vance's parlor, something was shifting, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the way that real things shift, the way foundations settle, the way the slow accumulation of pressure eventually finds the angle that moves the stone. "What would the committee need?" Clara said carefully, "to open a review." Helen Vance picked up her teacup. "Documentation," she said, "of a pattern. The land office complaints the note transfer, the timing, the principles involved." She looked at Clara over the rim of the cup. "Do you have that?" Clara opened her notebook. She had all of it. Helen Vance spent 40 minutes with Clara's notebook that evening, turning pages, slowly reading each entry with the focused attention of a woman who had spent 20 years on county committees, learning exactly what documentation looked like when it was built to survive scrutiny and what it looked like when it was built to impress. She didn't say anything while she read. Thomas sat across the parlor with his hat on his knee and his jaw set, watching Helen's face for any signal, and Clara sat with her hands folded and her expression entirely steady, which cost her more than it looked like it cost her. Finally, Helen set the notebook down. "This is good," she said. "Good enough?" Clara asked. "Good enough to open a review," Helen said. "Whether it's good enough to stop a 45-day clock is a different question." She looked at Clara directly. "The committee meets the first Thursday of the month. That's 9 days from now." 9 days, Thomas said. "The review itself, once opened, triggers a standard hold on any property transactions connected to the entities under review," Helen said. "That includes debt transfers and foreclosure actions." Clara felt something shift in her chest, not relief, not yet, but the first suggestion of it, the faint outline of a door that might open. "A hold," she said. "How long?" "Minimum 30 days while the review is conducted," Helen said. "Potentially longer if the committee finds sufficient cause to escalate to the Territorial Land Affairs Board. 30 days on top of 45 days. 75 days total." Clara's mind was already moving. "That's enough time to get the fall wheat committed," she said, more to herself than to the room. "And if we can secure a forward contract on the cattle—" "Clara." Thomas's voice was quiet. She looked at him. "One thing at a time," he said. She looked at him for a moment. He was right. She nodded. "What do you need from us for the committee?" she asked Helen. "A formal, written submission by Tuesday. Helen said. "Everything in this notebook organized chronologically. The land office complaints, the note transfer documents, the Meridian Land Trust Incorporation records, a clear accounting of the timeline, showing the relationship between Caldwell's offer to purchase and the subsequent actions against the property." She paused. "And I need it to be airtight. Marsh has a lawyer in Denver. If there's anything loose in your documentation, he'll pull on it." "There's nothing loose," Clara said. Helen looked at her for a moment with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was in that neighborhood. "No," she said, "I don't imagine there is." They drove home in the dark, which Clara had not intended, and Thomas had not complained about, and somewhere along the 12 miles between Millbrook and Hatcher's Creek, the night turned genuinely cold, in the way Colorado nights did, even in late summer, the temperature dropping fast once the sun was gone. Thomas pulled a blanket from behind the wagon seat without being asked and handed it to her without comment, and she took it without comment, and they drove for a while without talking. Then Thomas said, 9 days. 9 days to get the submission done, she said. I can do it in 3 if you help me organize the land office copies. I meant... He stopped, started again. 9 days is a long time for Caldwell to not know what we're doing. She had been thinking about that too. He'll find out, she said. People talk. The county recorder's office, the committee meeting notice he'll hear something within the week. And then what does he do? That depends on how worried he is, Clara said. If he thinks the review is a real threat, he applies more pressure. Faster. She paused. He might try to move on the foreclosure before the committee meets, push Meridian to accelerate the timeline. Can they do that, call the note faster than 45 days? Depends on the original loan agreement, she said. I need to read the full document. Do you have it? Somewhere, Thomas said. In the desk. Eleanor filed everything in the desk. Tonight, she said. When we get back. He nodded. The horse moved steadily through the dark, and the mountains were shapes against the stars, and Clara sat with the blanket over her shoulders and the cold on her face, and thought about Richard Caldwell sitting somewhere in his well-furnished house, comfortable, patient, watching the clock on a plan he had spent 2 years building. She thought about how he had looked at her on the street in Millbrook. The recalibration, the careful eyes. He had not expected her. That was still true. But a man like Caldwell did not stay surprised for long. The loan document was in the desk in a folder, labeled in Eleanor Whitaker's neat handwriting, and Clara read it at the kitchen table by lamplight, while Thomas made coffee and stood by the stove because he could not sit still. It took her 20 minutes to read it fully, because she read it twice, and when she set it down, her expression had shifted into something Thomas had not seen before. Not alarm exactly, but its near neighbor. There's an acceleration clause, she said. Thomas turned from the stove. What does that mean? It means the note holder has the right to demand full payment immediately, not in 45 days in full, now under certain conditions, she said. The conditions listed here are default property damage, or... She stopped. Or what? Thomas said. Or transfer of property interest without the note holder's consent. She looked up at him. Thomas, when I filed the formal response to the land office complaints, did those filings list me as a partner in the property? He stared at her. You told me to file them under both our names, he said slowly. You said it would carry more legal weight with 2 signatories. I know what I said, she said. I wasn't thinking about the loan agreement. She looked back at the document. A transfer of property interest. Depending on how broadly Marsh's lawyer reads that clause, adding a partner to the property's legal filings could be interpreted as... Don't say it, Thomas said. She said it anyway because the truth didn't get better from being avoided. Grounds for immediate acceleration, not 45 days, immediate. The kitchen was very quiet. Thomas put down the coffee pot. He came to the table and sat down. He looked at the document. Can they actually do that? He said. Use that clause. A good lawyer can argue almost anything, Clara said. Whether it would hold up is a different question, but arguing it doesn't need to hold up. Arguing it in court takes time and money we don't have. Thomas put his face in his hands. Not a dramatic gesture, something more private than that, the movement of a man who needs 1 second of darkness before he looks at the light again. Clara watched him and did not say anything and did not look away. He raised his head after a moment. His eyes were clear. "What do we do?" he said. "We find out if they know about the filings," she said. "If Caldwell doesn't know yet, we may have time. If he already knows..." She tapped the document. "We need a lawyer who understands territorial property law, and we need one before Tuesday." "Clara, a lawyer costs money." "I know," she said. "Does Walt Greer know anyone in Millbrook?" "Walt knows everybody," Thomas said tiredly. "Then you're riding to Walt's first thing tomorrow," she said. He nodded. He was looking at the loan document still, and at Eleanor's handwriting on the folder, and at Clara's hands, with their ink-stained fingers, resting on the table beside it all, and his face held a complicated kind of grief. Not fresh grief, not the sharp kind, but the grief of a man who sees how much he didn't know, and how much that not knowing had cost him, and who is trying to figure out how to hold that and keep moving at the same time. "Clara," he said. "Yes, I should have read this document years ago," he said. "I signed it and I filed it, and I never..." He stopped. "Eleanor filed everything. After she died, I left it all in the desk." "Thomas," she said, and her voice was entirely without judgment. "You were keeping cattle alive in a Colorado winter alone and grieving your wife. You did what you could do." She paused. "You can't go back and read a document you didn't read. You can read it now. That's what we're doing." He looked at her. "How do you do that?" he said. "Do what?" "Say things that make it sound like the facts are just the facts," he said. "Not shameful, not a disaster, just the situation." "Because they are just the facts," she said. "Shame doesn't help. Facts do." He reached across the table then, and it was not like the brief press of his hand from weeks ago. This was deliberate, his hand covering hers and staying. She looked down at it. Then she looked up at him. "I'm glad you came," he said. "I know I've said things close to that before, but I want to be plain about it. I'm glad you came, and I'm glad you stayed, and whatever happens with the bank and Caldwell and all the rest of it, I'm glad you're here." Clara looked at him for a long moment. "I'm glad I came too," she said, and meant it with a precision and weight that she hadn't expected when she wrote back to a 4-sentence letter from a Colorado rancher she'd never met. Walt Greer knew a lawyer. Of course he did. The lawyer's name was James Aldridge. He was based in Millbrook. He had 20 years of territorial property law behind him, and he was, Walt said with the tone of a man offering a minor caveat, somewhat expensive. Thomas and Clara sat in Aldridge's office on Friday morning, which was 2 days after the kitchen table conversation and 7 days before the committee meeting, and Aldridge read the loan document and the Meridian Land Trust Incorporation records and the committee submission draft that Clara had already completed in 2 days, which caused him to look at her over his reading glasses in a way that suggested he was revising his expectations. "The acceleration clause is real," Aldridge said when he finished, "but it requires written notice of the claimed triggering event before it takes effect. Have you received any notice from Meridian Land Trust beyond the original 45-day call?" "No," Clara said. "Then they either don't know about the property interest transfer yet," Aldridge said, "or they're deciding whether to use it." He set the documents down. "Here is the problem. If they invoke the acceleration clause, your 45 days becomes 0 days. You'd need to respond in court to challenge the invocation, and a court challenge in the territorial system takes..." "How long?" Clara said. 3 to 5 months minimum," Aldridge said, "which means you'd be operating under a cloud for the duration. You couldn't sell the property, couldn't refinance, couldn't enter new contracts without disclosure." "Which is exactly what Caldwell wants," Thomas said. His voice had a flatness to it that Clara recognized not defeat, but the voice of a man who is understanding something clearly for the first time and not enjoying the clarity. "Almost certainly," Aldridge agreed. What about the committee review? Clara said. If the review triggers a hold on transactions connected to Meridian, does that include an acceleration notice? Aldridge looked at her for a moment. That is a very good question, he said slowly. And the answer is probably yes if the committee moves fast enough. The hold would cover all adverse actions by entities under review. He paused. Which means the timing matters enormously. If Meridian sends an acceleration notice before Thursday's committee meeting. Can we get the committee to meet earlier? Clara said. Aldridge looked at her. Helen Vance chairs that committee, he said. I know, Clara said. Can she call an emergency session? Another long look. Theoretically, he said. Under the county charter, the chair can convene an emergency session with 48 hours notice if there is documented evidence of an ongoing harm to county property interests. He paused. That would require the documentation to be submitted immediately today, and Helen Vance to agree that the circumstances qualify. Clara stood up. How much do we owe you for this hour? She said. Aldridge named a figure. She did the calculation. It was most of the egg money from the past 2 weeks. She counted it out of her bag without flinching, and Thomas watched her do it, and then quietly added the remainder from his own pocket, and neither of them said anything about it. One more question, Clara said at the door. In your professional assessment, is what Caldwell has done illegal? Aldridge considered carefully. Purchasing a note on a property you want to acquire is not illegal, he said. Filing land complaints against a neighboring property with the intent to create legal pressure is not illegal. Using a holding company to obscure your involvement in a financial transaction is not illegal. He paused. But if it can be demonstrated that the land complaints were filed with false or exaggerated claims of damage, that's a different matter. And if the note purchase was coordinated with the land complaints as part of a deliberate scheme to force a sale below market value. He paused again longer this time. There are territorial statutes on predatory property acquisition that haven't been tested much, but they exist. Clara looked at him for one more moment. Thank you, she said, and walked out. Helen Vance agreed to the emergency session by noon that same day. She sent word to the committee members by Friday evening and posted the legal notice required by the county charter on the courthouse door Saturday morning, which meant the emergency session would convene Monday. 2 days earlier than the original Thursday meeting. 2 days that might be everything. What happened Saturday afternoon was something Clara had not anticipated, which was unusual enough to be unsettling. She was in the chicken coop, the now repaired, properly ventilated, properly fed chicken coop with its 22 hens and 2 healthy roosters, which had been producing with the kind of enthusiastic consistency that Clara had predicted. And Thomas had privately not quite believed when she heard a wagon coming up the track faster than wagons normally came. She came out to find it was the Greer boy, Walt's youngest, riding alone and looking like he'd pushed the horse hard. Mrs. Whitaker, he said, and the name, which was not precisely accurate, but which people in the county had been using for the past 3 weeks with increasing frequency, landed on her the way it always did, with a small internal adjustment she hadn't decided what to do with. Mr. Greer says to tell you Caldwell was at the bank in Millbrook this morning. She went still. Henderson's bank. Yes, ma'am. Mr. Greer's cousin works there. He says Caldwell was there for an hour, and he left with papers. She turned and walked toward the house. Where's Thomas? North pasture, ma'am. Should I get him? She said. Please. Thomas came back from the north pasture at a run, which was how Clara had described the urgency, and found her at the kitchen table with the loan document and Aldridge's card and her notebook, and an expression that had gone very focused and very still. What happened? He said. I think Caldwell just found out about the committee submission, she said. He was at Henderson's bank this morning with papers. Aldridge said an acceleration notice requires written documentation of the triggering event. If Caldwell had someone pull the land office filings and found both our names, he's sending the acceleration notice, Thomas said. He's going to try, she said. If he sends it Monday before the committee session. When does the session start? 10 o'clock Monday morning, she said. Aldridge will be there. Helen will have the submission. She looked up at him. We need to make sure the notice doesn't arrive before 10 o'clock Monday. Thomas stared at her. How do we do that? Legally, the notice has to be delivered by a county officer or by registered post, she said. Registered post from Millbrook to Hatcher's Creek typically takes 1 day, Thomas said. If it was sent today, it could arrive tomorrow. Sunday delivery is rare, Clara said, but not impossible. Thomas sat down. Clara, what are you telling me? I'm telling you that if an officer of the county shows up at this door tomorrow with a registered notice, we do not sign for it, she said. He looked at her. Is that legal? You cannot be compelled to accept a registered notice, she said. It must be properly served. If we're not available to receive it, we'd have to be gone from the property, he said. Somewhere we could plausibly have been, she said. Since Saturday. Thomas looked at the table, at the loan document, at Clara's notebook, at the hands that had been writing and calculating and building something out of what had been nothing for nearly 2 months, and the face above them that was doing what it always did. Looking at the hard thing directly without flinching, without pretending it was different than it was, without offering false comfort, but also without surrendering. Walt Greer's place, Thomas said slowly. He's been asking us to come for supper for 2 weeks. If we went tonight and stayed through Sunday, the Monday morning post wouldn't reach Walt's address, Clara said. And if an officer came to the homestead and no one was home, he'd have to try again, Thomas said. After 10 o'clock Monday, Clara said. The silence between them had a particular texture, not comfortable. Not the silence of people who are at ease, but the silence of two people who are looking at something together and understanding it the same way, which is a different thing entirely and in some ways more intimate. Is this right? Thomas said. What we're doing. Clara considered that honestly. We're not obstructing anything, she said. We're not hiding evidence. We're not lying. We are choosing not to be home on a Saturday evening, which is a thing people do. She paused. What Caldwell has done, the complaints the note purchased the acceleration clause he's about to invoke all of it, has been technically legal and entirely designed to take this property for less than it's worth from a man who was too grief-stricken and isolated to fight back. We are fighting back, with the tools available to us. Thomas looked at her for a long time. All right, he said. I'll go tell Walt we're coming for supper. Walt Greer, to his considerable credit, did not ask a single question. He said, "Come on," and his wife Martha put 2 extra plates on the table and made enough food for 8 people, because Martha Greer operated on the principle that you never knew how many you'd be feeding, and it was better to have too much. And they sat around the Greer table that Saturday evening, and ate and talked about the wheat prices, and the fall weather, and the new schoolmaster in Millbrook, and the Women's Auxiliary fundraiser. And if Walt noticed that both Thomas and Clara seemed to be listening carefully every time a horse or wagon came down the road past the property, he did not mention it. Sunday passed. No officer came to Walt's door. No notice arrived. Monday morning, Clara and Thomas were in Aldridge's office at 9:15, and Aldridge had the committee submission neatly organized and Clara's additional notes incorporated. And at 9:50, they walked with him to the county hall, where the emergency session of the Territorial Land Affairs Committee was convened at 10 o'clock by Helen Vance, who sat at the head of the table with her reading glasses on and the particular air of a woman who has been underestimated by enough powerful men to have entirely stopped finding it surprising. There were 5 committee members. 3 of them had read Clara's submission over the weekend. The other 2 read it at the table, while Aldridge presented the timeline. At 10:47, a county officer arrived at the door of the county hall with a registered notice addressed to Thomas Whitaker at the Hatcher's Creek Homestead, which had been produced by the law offices of M. Garrett and Associates in Denver on behalf of the Meridian Land Trust, and which constituted formal invocation of the acceleration clause in the Whitaker Homestead loan agreement. The officer asked for Thomas Whitaker. Thomas stood up. Aldridge stood up faster. "Before my client accepts service," he said clearly and firmly, "I'd like to note for the record of this committee session that the notice being served pertains directly to the entities currently under emergency review, specifically the Meridian Land Trust, and that the committee's hold on adverse actions by entities under review is now in effect as of the session's opening at 10 o'clock this morning. He looked at Helen Vance. Chair, I'd ask the committee to confirm the time of session opening for the record. Helen Vance looked at the county clerk, who was seated beside her with a large ledger. The session was called to order at 10 o'clock and 2 minutes, the clerk said, reading from the ledger. I have it recorded. The officer looked at the notice in his hand. He looked at Aldridge. He looked at Helen Vance. The notice is timed at 10:23, he said slowly, this morning. Which is after the session opened, Aldridge said. Which means the committee's hold was in effect before this notice was generated. The room was very quiet. The officer said, I'll need to speak to the postmaster, and left. Thomas sat back down. His legs, Clara observed from where she was sitting beside him, were not entirely steady. She did not point this out. She put her hand on the table close to his, but not touching it, and he looked at her and she looked back, and the thing that passed between them in that look was not a thing either of them had words for yet, but it was real, and it was solid, and it had the weight of something that was going to last. Helen Vance looked at the committee members over her reading glasses. Shall we proceed? She said. They proceeded. The formal review opened at 11 o'clock. Aldridge presented the documentation. The committee asked questions, careful, specific, lawyerly questions that suggested at least 2 of the members had some legal background, and Clara answered the ones directed at her with the same clear, direct, fact-based delivery she brought to everything. And Thomas answered the ones directed at him with a steadiness that she suspected was partly adrenaline and partly something else. Something that had been building in him since the morning she handed him back those 2 foreclosure letters and told him 45 days was enough time. At 12:30, the committee voted 4-1 to open a formal review of Meridian Land Trust's acquisition of the Whitaker note and the related land office complaint filings, and to place a hold on all adverse property actions connected to Meridian Land Trust pending the outcome of the review. The hold was good for 60 days minimum. 60 days. They walked out of the county hall into the bright Colorado noon, and Thomas stopped on the steps and stood there for a moment, and Clara stopped beside him, and she could feel him recalibrating, the way a man recalibrates when something he had given up on starts looking possible again. The particular internal shift of that which is not a small thing even when it's quiet. 60 days, he said. 60 days, she confirmed. Clara? He turned to look at her. His face was doing something undefended again. Something she was getting better at reading, the particular expression of Thomas Whitaker when he was feeling more than he knew how to say, and was going to try to say it anyway. I want to ask you something. All right. This started as an arrangement, he said. You know that. I know that. You came because you needed a place, and I needed help, and we were both honest about that from the first letter. Yes, she said. And what it's become. He stopped. Started again. I don't know what you think it's become. I know what I think it's become, but I don't want to assume. The Millbrook Street was busy around them, people moving in and out of the shops, a wagon passing 2 women talking in front of the dry goods store, and Clara Bennett stood on the county hall steps with the Colorado sun on her face, and looked at this man, this honest, wounded, stubborn, decent man who had forgotten to pick her up at the train station and apologized for it with everything he had done since. Thomas, she said, ask me. He took a breath. Will you stay? He said. Not because of the arrangement. Not because of the homestead or the debt or any of it. Will you stay because you want to? Because this is... He looked at her steadily. Because this is home. Clara looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, I walked 4 miles in July heat to get here. I know, he said. And I've ridden 12 miles to Millbrook more times than I can count, she said. And I've sat across the table from Richard Caldwell and James Aldridge and Henderson at the bank and Helen Vance and every other person who had a piece of this fight in their hands, and I did all of it because... She stopped. Let herself feel it just for a second, the full weight of the answer she was about to give. Because this is already home, she said. It has been for a while. I just wanted to make sure we could keep it. Thomas Whitaker stood on those courthouse steps, and looked at Clara Bennett with the particular expression of a man who has just been given back something he had already decided to grieve, and the feeling was so large that all he could do with it was nod once, slow the way men nod when words have run out, and then reach out and take her hand right there in the middle of Millbrook's main street in front of the dry goods store, and the passing wagon, and the two women who would absolutely tell everyone they knew about it before supper. Clara let him hold it. And somewhere behind them in the county hall, the clerk was recording the committee vote in the ledger, and Richard Caldwell was going to find out about it before the day was done. And there were still 60 days of work ahead, and a wheat crop to commit, and a fence to finish, and a debt to close. And none of that had changed, and all of it still mattered, and Clara Bennett knew every number and every deadline and every step of what came next. But right now, on these steps in this noon light, she held Thomas Whitaker's hand and let herself feel just for this one moment the solid and extraordinary fact of having found something worth fighting for. And then she said, "We should get back. The chickens won't feed themselves." Thomas laughed. It was the first time she had heard him laugh, really laugh unguarded and whole, and the sound of it was so unexpected and so genuinely good that she found herself smiling back before she could think about it. And they walked down the steps together, still holding hands into the bright afternoon. They were back at the homestead by mid-afternoon, and the chickens did in fact need feeding. And Clara did it herself, while Thomas unhitched the wagon and the ordinary rhythm of it, the familiar weight of the feed bucket, the sound of the flock moving toward her. The smell of the coop she had rebuilt from near ruin settled something in her chest that the courthouse steps had stirred loose. She was not a woman who trusted feelings that arrived too fast or burned too bright. She trusted this one because it had built slowly the way good things built out of hard work and honest days, and the particular intimacy of two people fighting for the same piece of ground. Thomas came into the coop while she was counting the eggs. 17, she said without looking up. "That's the best day yet," he said. "We need 25 consistently before I'll feel comfortable about the Morrison school contract through winter," she said. "But we're close." She set the last egg in the basket. "The wheat commitment. I want to talk to the grain merchant in Millbrook this week, before Caldwell has time to make calls." Thomas leaned against the coop doorway. "You think he'll try to block the grain contract too?" "I think he's going to be very busy in the next week finding out what happened today and deciding what to do about it," Clara said. "Which means we should be busier." She finally looked up at him. "Are you all right?" He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I don't know exactly what I am," he said. "I feel like a man who just watched something that was about to run him over get stopped a foot away, and I'm still standing in the road." "That's a reasonable way to feel," she said. "I keep thinking about Caldwell sitting somewhere right now, finding out the committee voted," Thomas said. "And I can't decide if I feel satisfied or scared." "Both is correct," Clara said. "The review bought us time. It didn't end anything." She picked up the egg basket. "He's going to respond. We need to be ready for what that looks like." What it looked like arrived faster than either of them expected. Tuesday morning before breakfast, Walt Greer rode up to the gate at a pace that meant news, and his news was, this Richard Caldwell had been to the county commissioner's office the previous afternoon within 3 hours of the committee vote. He had filed a formal objection to the emergency session, arguing that the 48-hour notice requirement had not been properly met, which was a technical argument that Aldridge had anticipated, and which Helen Vance had, according to Walt, described to the commissioner in the particular tone she used when she found something both wrong and tedious. The commissioner ruled against him, Walt said in the kitchen, accepting coffee from Clara, with the grateful efficiency of a man who has ridden 6 miles on an empty stomach. But Caldwell's lawyer filed a secondary objection about the composition of the committee, says Helen Vance has a conflict of interest because she knows you folks personally. Clara and Thomas looked at each other across the kitchen table. "A conflict of interest," Thomas said. "That's what they're claiming," Walt said. "If the objection holds, the session gets invalidated. And the hold goes with it." Clara set her coffee down. "How long does the commissioner have to rule on the secondary objection?" "Aldridge would know," Walt said. She was already reaching for her coat. Thomas stood up. "I'll get the horse," he said. Aldridge knew. Aldridge knew specifically that the commissioner had 5 business days to rule on a conflict of interest objection, and that during those 5 days, the hold remained technically in effect, but was challengeable, which meant it was a hold with teeth that might or might not bite, depending on how the commissioner read the county charter's definition of personal acquaintance versus material conflict. "Will he rule in our favor?" Clara asked. Aldridge considered this with the careful honesty she had come to appreciate in him. "The conflict of interest standard in this county is material financial interest," he said. "Helen Vance has no financial stake in the outcome of the Whitaker property. She knows you. Half the county knows you, you've made sure of that. That's not a legal conflict." He paused. "But commissioners are political animals. Caldwell has money and he has relationships. The question is whether those relationships extend to Commissioner Burke." "Does Helen Vance have a relationship with Commissioner Burke?" Clara said. Aldridge smiled, which was not an expression she had seen on him before. "Helen Vance has chaired the County Land Affairs Committee for 11 years, he said. "She has outlasted 3 commissioners. Burke has been in office for 2 years, and he is by all accounts a man who understands which way the wind blows." "Then we need to make sure the wind is blowing the right direction," Clara said. She spent Tuesday afternoon writing letters, 3 of them to the Morrison School, to the Millbrook Hotel kitchen, and to Helen Vance's Women's Auxiliary, formally confirming the egg supply contracts and the beginning of the fall production schedule. Each letter contained the phrase, "The Whitaker Homestead under current management." Each letter was sent to the county recorder's office as a matter of public commercial record, because Clara had learned from Abbott at the land office that commercial transactions above a certain modest value could be voluntarily registered, which created a public paper trail of an operating productive business. Thomas watched her seal the 3rd envelope. "You're building a record," he said, "of the homestead as a going concern." "I'm building a record that any judge or commissioner or territorial board can look at and see a functioning business that was being deliberately targeted," she said. "Not a failing property, not a desperate man selling at any price. A going concern with contracts and buyers and a future." "You thought of this before Caldwell filed the objection," Thomas said. "It was not a question." "I thought of it before we went to Millbrook the first time," she said. "I just didn't have enough contracts to make it worth doing yet." Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then, "Clara, can I ask you something?" "You can always ask me something." "When does it stop?" he said. "The planning, the anticipating, the—" He gestured at the letters, the notebook, the careful and relentless architecture of everything she built. "When do you just let it be?" She looked at him for a long moment. "When it's safe," she said. And there was something in her voice just briefly that was not Clara, the strategist, or Clara, the farmer, or Clara, who read loan documents at midnight. There was something underneath all of that. The woman who had watched her own farm disappear and couldn't stop it, who had planned and calculated and worked and lost anyway, and who had come to Colorado with 2 bags and a started sourdough, because standing still was not something she knew how to do when there was still something left to save. Thomas looked at her with the full weight of his attention, which she had noticed was considerable when he chose to give it. "It's going to be safe," he said quietly. "We're going to make it safe." "I know," she said. "But you don't feel it yet," he said. She looked at the letters in her hand. "Not entirely," she admitted. "Not yet." He reached across and took the letters from her gently, no force to it, and set them on the table. "Come look at the north fence," he said. "I finished the last section this afternoon." She looked at him. "The north fence." "It took Walt and me 4 days, and it's done," he said. "Every post, set right new wires staked at the base. No cattle getting through that for 20 years. He held out his hand. "Come look at it." It was, she knew not really about the fence. But she took his hand, and they walked out together in the late afternoon, and she looked at the north fence line solid and true, and finished stretching the full length of the property boundary, and she stood there for a long minute and let herself feel it. The realness of it. the thing that was done and would stay done. "Good work," she said finally. "We did it together," he said. And for the first time since she had arrived in Colorado, Clara Bennett let herself stop calculating long enough to simply stand next to Thomas Whitaker in the quiet of a late summer afternoon and feel with something very close to certainty that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Commissioner Burke ruled on the conflict of interest objection Thursday morning, 48 hours after it was filed. He ruled against Caldwell. The hold stood. Walt Greer brought the news before noon, and this time Martha Greer came with him and brought a pie, and they sat at the Whitaker kitchen table and ate it. And Thomas talked more in 2 hours than Clara had heard him talk in the entire time she'd known him, and Walt and Martha exchanged a look over their coffee cups that was the particular look of two people who have been friends with a man for years and are watching him come back to himself. The ruling was not the end. Caldwell still held through Meridian the loan note. The committee review would take 30 to 60 days. The debt was still real, but the pressure had changed shape, and changed shape mattered, because pressure that comes at you in a straight line is far harder to redirect than pressure that has to find a new angle. Caldwell found a new angle the following week. It came through a man named Peters. Gerald Peters, who appeared at the Homestead on a Wednesday morning and introduced himself as a land assessor from the county, and who produced documentation that appeared entirely official, and who informed Thomas that a formal property assessment had been ordered in connection with the outstanding loan review, and that the assessment would begin immediately. Thomas came to find Clara in the garden, where she was turning the last of the summer beds in preparation for the fall planting. "There's a county assessor at the door," he said. "Says he's here to assess the property for the loan review." Clara set down her spade. "Show me his documentation," she said. She read the documentation on the front porch while Peters stood on the step below and waited with the patience of a man who expected to be challenged and was prepared for it. The papers looked right. The county seal looked right. The signature at the bottom looked right. "Who ordered this assessment?" she asked. "It's a standard procedure," Peters said, "triggered by the active loan review." "That's not what I asked," she said. "Who ordered it?" A brief pause. "The County Loan Review Board," Peters said. Clara looked at Aldridge's card, which she carried in her coat pocket now as a matter of course. "I'll need to verify that with our attorney before we can permit access," she said. "If you'd like to wait, I can send for him, or you're welcome to return tomorrow with written confirmation from the board directly." Peters looked at her. He was a middle-aged man with a neutral face and very still eyes. The kind of eyes that didn't give much away. And for the first time since she had been in Colorado, Clara felt a cold and specific unease that was different from the legal and financial pressure. She had been managing something more personal than that, something that said this man is here for a reason beyond what he stated. "That won't be necessary," Peters said. He put his documentation back in his bag. "I'll reschedule." He turned and walked to his horse. She watched him ride out. Then she went inside and wrote to Aldridge that afternoon. Aldridge's response came the next morning by way of his office boy, who wrote out with a sealed letter, and the letter said 3 things. First, there was no county loan review board. That was not a body that existed under the territorial charter. Second, the seal on Peters's documentation was the county seal, but the office listed on the letterhead did not exist. Third, Aldridge had made inquiries, and a man matching Peters' description had been seen the previous week at Caldwell's CCC ranch. Thomas read the letter standing at the kitchen table. "He sent someone to falsify an assessment," he said. "Why?" "Because a property assessment can generate a valuation," Clara said. "And a valuation that comes in low, that claims the homestead is worth less than the outstanding loan, gives Meridian grounds to argue the collateral is insufficient and escalate the foreclosure proceedings outside the committee's review scope." She paused. "He needed a number on paper that hurt us. He couldn't get it through the legitimate process because the committee's hold would have applied, so he tried to create a private one." Thomas set the letter down. His face had gone through several things in the course of reading it, and had settled on something that was not anger. Exactly, anger was too simple for what she saw, but was the expression of a man who has understood something clearly and completely for the first time and will not be going back to not understanding it. He was never going to stop, Thomas said. No, Clara said. Not even if I'd sold to him in the beginning, Thomas said slowly. Not the land complaints, not the note purchase. Those aren't the moves of a man who wants a fair deal. Those are the moves of a man who wants to win. Yes, she said. What does a man like that do? Thomas said, when he realizes he's losing. Clara looked at him steadily. He gets reckless, she said. Peter's false assessment attempt was the second piece of documentation Aldridge brought to the committee. It arrived with an affidavit from the county clerk confirming that no such assessment had been authorized by any county body, and a statement from Walt Greer's cousin identifying Peters as a man he had seen at the CCC. The committee chair, Helen Vance, received it with the expression of a woman who had been waiting for exactly this. This changes the nature of the review, Aldridge told them in his office Friday afternoon. What started as a review of the note transfer process has now become an investigation into potential fraud. That is a materially different thing. Different how? Thomas asked. Different in that fraud falls under territorial criminal statute, not just land affairs regulation, Aldridge said, which means it can be referred to the territorial marshal's office. He paused. And it means the committee has grounds to request a temporary injunction against any adverse action by Meridian Land Trust until the investigation is complete. An injunction, Clara said. Not a hold, an injunction. A hold can be challenged and can expire, Aldridge said. An injunction issued in connection with a fraud investigation is considerably harder to dislodge. He looked at her. It also means this is no longer a civil matter. If Caldwell's fingerprints are on the Peters visit, and we have a witness placing Peters at the CCC, then someone is looking at criminal exposure. Thomas sat back in his chair. The sound he made was not quite a laugh and not quite a breath. Something in between the sound of a man who has been holding tension in his chest for so long that when it starts to release, his body doesn't quite know what to do with the space. Clara, he said. Don't say anything yet, she said quietly. It's not over yet. I know, he said, but I want to say it anyway. He looked at her. I put an advertisement in a newspaper asking for a woman who could help me keep some chickens alive. And you came and you... He stopped. What you've done, what you've built. I want you to know that I see it. Every single piece of it. She looked at him for a long moment. I see what you've done too, she said. You've let me. That's not a small thing, Thomas. A lot of men wouldn't have. He held her gaze. I'm not a lot of men, he said simply. No, she said. You're not. Aldridge cleared his throat with the professional discretion of a man who has learned to be invisible in his own office when necessary. I'll file the injunction application Monday, he said. And I'll submit the Peters documentation to the marshal's office simultaneously. The injunction was granted the following Wednesday. Clara was in the garden when Thomas came running from the house with Aldridge's messenger behind him, and she read the single-page notice right there in the garden with soil on her hands, and the specific language of it all. Adverse actions by Meridian Land Trust and affiliated entities are hereby enjoined pending the completion of the territorial fraud investigation was not the most elegant writing she had ever read, but it was the most welcome. She folded it carefully and put it in her coat pocket. It's done, Thomas said. The immediate threat is done, she said. The investigation will take time. The debt still exists, and we still have to address it. But Meridian can't move against us while the investigation runs. And if the fraud finding holds, the note transfer itself may be voided. Voided, Thomas said. Thomas, if the note was purchased as part of a scheme to defraud, and what we've documented suggests it was, the territorial court can invalidate the transfer and revert the note to Henderson's bank, Clara said. Henderson is not Caldwell. Henderson made a deal with us, and he had a reason to break it, which was money, but he doesn't have Caldwell's history with this property. Thomas looked at her. You think we could renegotiate with Henderson? I think Henderson is a banker who is now aware that the man he sold our note to is under a fraud investigation, Clara said. And I think Henderson has a reputation to protect and a community to do business in for the next 20 years. She looked at the injunction notice in her hand. I'd like to find out. Henderson agreed to meet with them the following week. He was a careful man. Henderson not warm, not particularly sympathetic, but genuinely scrupulous in the way that some bankers are the ones who got into the business because they believed in the function of it rather than just the profit. He sat across from Thomas and Clara in his office, and he read the injunction notice and the summary of the fraud investigation that Aldridge had prepared, and when he was done, he set both documents on his desk and folded his hands. I should not have sold that note, he said. It was the most direct thing Clara had heard a man in his position say in a very long time, and she appreciated it enough to say so. I appreciate that, Mr. Henderson. I was approached with a very good offer, Henderson said. I didn't ask enough questions about why. He paused. What are you proposing? We're proposing that when the territorial court voids the meridian transfer which Aldridge believes is the likely outcome, you honor the original 60-day arrangement, Clara said. With one modification, we want to restructure the payment schedule on the original arrears. Extend the timeline from 60 days to 1 year with monthly payments. Henderson looked at his hands. The note principal isn't in question. No, Clara said. We intend to pay the full note. We're asking for manageable terms on catching up the arrears which we can demonstrate we have the income to support. She opened her notebook and turned it to face him. This is our current income projection through spring. Egg sales school contract, women's auxiliary supply, the Millbrook Hotel kitchen. And the winter wheat we've committed to the grain merchant, here's that contract. Henderson looked at the notebook for a long time. Clara let him look. Miss Bennett, he said finally. When I agreed to 60 days, I thought I was being generous to a struggling ranch. You were, she said. What I see here, he said, tapping the notebook, is not a struggling ranch. No, she said. It isn't. Not anymore. He leaned back. Give me a week to review the projection in detail, he said. And if the court moves on the meridian transfer, as your attorney expects, I'll agree to the restructured timeline. Thomas shook his hand. Clara shook his hand. And walking out of the bank and into the Millbrook afternoon, Thomas put his arm around her shoulders briefly, just for a second, one solid gesture of something that didn't need words, and she leaned into it for exactly that second before they both straightened up and kept walking. The week that followed was the quietest week since Clara's arrival, and the quiet had a different quality than the quiet of those first days. Not the quiet of a place that had run out of energy, but the quiet of a place catching its breath. She planted the fall garden. She brought the flock to 26 hens. She wrote the monthly supply letters to her 3 regular buyers and added a 4th, a boarding house in Millbrook that Helen Vance had connected her with. Thomas finished the Eastfield preparation with Walt Greer's help, working 2 long days to turn the soil and get it ready for winter wheat. They worked side by side in the evenings on the books, which Clara had taken over entirely by now. Not because Thomas couldn't understand them, but because he was better in the field, and she was better at the numbers, and they had both stopped pretending otherwise. He would come in from the pasture and wash up and sit across the table from her, and she would show him where they were, and he would ask questions, good questions, the kind that showed he was paying attention, and she would answer them, and they would figure out the next thing together. It was on one of these evenings, 3 weeks after the injunction, that Thomas set down his coffee and said without preamble, I want to ask you to marry me properly. Clara looked up from the ledger. Not the advertisement, he said. Not the arrangement. I want to ask you, Clara Bennett, who walked 4 miles in July heat and fixed my fence and outwitted Richard Caldwell and saved this homestead. He looked at her steadily. Will you marry me because I want you to? Because I can't imagine this place or this life without you in it. Because you are the most remarkable person I have ever known. Clara put down her pen. She looked at this man who had not been there to pick her up at the train station, who had opened every letter she asked him to open, and stood beside her. At every table she asked him to sit at, and held her hand on courthouse steps, and laughed finally and whole on a Millbrook afternoon. Who had said, I trust you, when it mattered most and meant it. who had looked at a large, plain, widowed Kansas farm woman with ink on her fingers and seen somehow exactly what she was. "Yes," she said. It was a simple word. It carried everything. Thomas reached across the table and took both her hands in his and held them the way a man holds something he has been given that he intends to deserve. Outside, the Colorado night was clear and cold, the kind of cold that said autumn was coming in earnest, and the wheat was in the ground, and the chickens were settled, and the north fence stood solid against whatever winter would bring. And in the kitchen of the Whitaker homestead, with the lamp burning, and the ledger open, and the notebook beside it full of Clara's clear, firm writing, two people who had come to each other out of necessity, and stayed out of something far more durable, sat together and held on, and the house around them felt for the first time in a very long time, like a home that knew it was going to last. The territorial court ruled on the Meridian Land Trust transfer on a Tuesday morning in late October, 6 weeks after the injunction was granted, and Aldridge sent his office boy to the homestead at a dead run with the news, because he knew correctly that neither Thomas nor Clara would want to wait until he could ride out himself. Clara read the ruling in the yard, still holding the egg basket from her morning rounds. Thomas came out of the barn when he heard the boy's horse and stood beside her while she read. And she read it twice, the way she read everything important. And then she looked up. "The transfer is voided," she said. "The note reverts to Henderson's bank, and the court has referred the fraud finding to the Territorial Marshal's office for criminal review." Thomas stood very still for a moment. "Criminal review," he said. "Caldwell, Marsh, and Peters," Clara said, "all three named." The boy on the horse was watching them with the bright attention of someone witnessing something he would describe to people for years. Clara handed him a coin and thanked him, and he rode off. Looking satisfied, and Thomas took the ruling from her hand and read it himself slowly, the way a man reads something he wants to be absolutely sure is real before he allows himself to feel it. When he looked up, his eyes were not entirely steady. "It's over," he said. "The immediate fight is over," Clara said. And then, because she had been thinking about the difference between those two things for 6 weeks, she said, "The rest of it is just work, and we're good at work." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he did something she hadn't expected. He laughed short and genuine, the same laugh she had first heard on the courthouse steps in Millbrook, and he pulled her into his arms right there in the yard with the egg basket still between them and held on, and she let him and let herself feel the full weight of what they had just done and what it had cost and what it meant. The basket survived. So did the eggs. She checked. Henderson honored the restructured agreement within the week. The meeting was brief and businesslike and entirely without the tension of their previous conversations, which Clara found almost disorienting. Sitting across from a banker and not bracing for bad news, not pre-calculating responses to what he might say, not running 3 contingency plans simultaneously in the back of her mind. Henderson presented the new payment schedule. She reviewed it. It was fair. She signed it. Thomas signed it. Henderson shook both their hands and said stiffly but genuinely that he was glad the situation had resolved as it had. Walking out of the bank, Thomas said, "You look like you don't know what to do with yourself." "I'm not used to a thing being finished," she admitted. "Get used to it," he said. "You finished it." She was going to correct him. "We finished it," but he had already pushed the door open for her and was holding it with one hand and gesturing with the other with the easy, unthinking courtesy of a man who had stopped worrying about whether any of this was appropriate and had started simply doing what felt right. She walked through the door without correcting him. She let the compliment stand. That was its own kind of progress. The wedding was small because neither of them wanted a spectacle, and both of them had lived enough to know that the size of a ceremony is no measurement of the size of the thing it marks. Walt and Martha Greer were there, and Helen Vance and Aldridge, and Morrison the schoolmaster, who had become an unlikely ally, and a handful of the townspeople from Hatcher's Creek who had started coming out to buy eggs and stayed to become something closer to neighbors. The minister was a plain-spoken man who had been out to the homestead twice to see for himself what all the county talk was about, and who had told Thomas afterward that he found the place considerably more impressive than the rumors. Clara wore her good blue dress, which she had brought in the bag with the books and the cast iron skillet and the sourdough starter, and which she had not worn once in the month since her arrival, because there had never been an occasion that felt worth it until now. Thomas wore a clean shirt and his good hat, and looked at her when she came downstairs with the expression of a man who keeps thinking he has understood the full extent of something and keeps being wrong. "You look beautiful," he said. Clara had been told she was many things in her life: capable, hard-working, sensible, stubborn. She had been told she was too large and too plain and too much and not enough in various combinations by various people at various points along the road that had brought her here. She had made her peace with most of it. She had built her life on the things she could do rather than the things she was supposed to be. Thomas Whitaker said, "You look beautiful," the way a man says something that is simply true without strategy or performance, and she felt it land somewhere that she had not known was still waiting to receive it. "Thank you," she said, and meant it with everything she had. The ceremony was 20 minutes. The supper afterward went 3 hours because Martha Greer had cooked enough for twice the number of people present, and Walt had brought a bottle of something that he described as whiskey, and that Thomas said generously was in the general category of whiskey, and Helen Vance told 3 stories about county politics that were funnier than anything Clara had heard in years. And at some point, the conversation moved from the kitchen table to the front porch, and then back inside, and the lamp burned low, and the guests eventually found their way home, and the homestead was quiet. Thomas and Clara sat at the kitchen table, after the way they always sat, the ledger within reach, the notebook at her elbow, the remains of Martha's supper between them, and neither of them said anything for a while. "Well," Thomas said finally. "Well," Clara agreed. He looked at the table, at the ledger, at the notebook, at her. "Are you going to calculate something?" he said. "Because I'd understand if you were." She laughed, genuinely the way she had been laughing more often in the past weeks. Not the careful, controlled acknowledgement she had offered in the first days, but something that came from lower down, something unrehearsed. "Not tonight," she said. "Good," he said. "Because the numbers are fine, and the fence is done, and the wheat is in the ground, and the chickens are locked up." He looked at her steadily. "And you are my wife, and this is our home." She held his gaze. "Yes," she said, "it is." The winter came in early and hard that year, the way Colorado winters came when they meant business, and it tested everything that Clara and Thomas had built. Not with drama, not with a single catastrophic event, but with the grinding, relentless pressure of cold and ice and shortened days, and animals that needed more feed than projected, and fences that strained under the weight of ice, and the particular brutality of a storm in early December that took out power to half the county and kept them both working in shifts for 36 hours to keep the livestock alive. It was during that storm at 2 in the morning when Clara was in the barn with the cattle, and Thomas came in from checking the chicken coop and found her there, and they stood together in the warm dark of the barn with the animals breathing around them and the storm doing what it was doing outside. And Thomas said, "You need to sleep." "So do you," she said. "Ladies first," he said, which made her look at him because she had never heard him use that particular kind of humor before, and he was grinning, tired and cold, and genuinely amused at himself, and she felt the specific and extraordinary warmth of being known by someone known well enough that they can be funny with you at 2 in the morning in a storm. 30 minutes, she said. Then you come in. Deal, he said. She was asleep in 20 minutes and didn't wake up until he came in, and she heard him on the stairs. And then she lay in the dark for a moment, listening to the storm ease and thinking about the cattle in the barn, and the chickens in the repaired coop, and the wheat under the frozen ground, and the accounts in the ledger that she knew by heart, and she felt something she had not felt in so long that it took her a moment to name it. Safe. She felt safe. Not because the storm was over. It wasn't yet. Not because everything was resolved. There was still the debt to service and the spring planting to plan, and a dozen problems waiting for the thaw. But safe in the way that mattered most, the knowledge that whatever came next, she would not face it alone. She had not realized until this moment how long it had been since that had been true. The Territorial Marshal's office moved on the fraud investigation in January, and the news came to Hatcher's Creek the way news always came to small counties all at once, from 3 directions simultaneously, with Walt Greer playing his usual role as the node through which all information flowed. Richard Caldwell had not been charged. That was the first thing Clara absorbed when Walt arrived with the news on a Thursday morning, and it landed harder than she expected, a brief cold drop of something that might have been disappointment if she had let herself feel it fully. Gerald Marsh had been charged. Peters had been charged. The evidence of the falsified assessment and the coordinated note purchase was sufficient for the territorial prosecutor to move on both of them. But Caldwell, whose fingerprints were on the strategy, and whose son-in-law had been named in the indictment, Caldwell, who had come to this homestead twice with his careful smile and his applied warmth, and his offer that was not an offer but a demand with a dollar sign on it. Caldwell had lawyers good enough to keep his name off the formal charges. Thomas was quiet when Walt finished. Then he said, "He walks." "For now," Walt said. He looked uncomfortable. "There's talk that the Territorial Board is looking at his land acquisition history more broadly. The water rights case Helen mentioned, and there's another property North County where the circumstances look similar to what happened here. But that takes time." Thomas looked at Clara. She could see what he was feeling because she knew his face now, the way you know the face of someone you have been looking at every day for months. The set of his jaw, the particular stillness that meant he was holding something difficult and deciding how to carry it. "It's not enough," he said, not to Walt, to her. "No," she said honestly. "It isn't. He built a 2-year plan to take this property," Thomas said. "He used his son-in-law and a fake assessor and the bank and the land office, and he almost succeeded, and he is going to ride back to the Triple C and have supper and wake up tomorrow like nothing happened." "Yes," Clara said. "He probably will, for now. That doesn't bother you." His voice was not accusatory. It was genuinely asking because he knew that Clara's relationship to injustice was not the same as his, that she had processed more of it for longer and had developed a different way of carrying it. "It bothers me," she said, "but I've learned to put the things I can't change in one category and the things I can in another." She looked at him directly. "We can make this homestead something that Caldwell can never touch, regardless of whether he is ever held accountable for what he tried to do. We can make it so visible and so productive and so connected to this county that any future attempt against it would be seen for what it is before it got started." She paused. "That's what I can do. So that's what I'm going to do." Thomas looked at her for a long moment. Then something settled in his face. Not resignation, but the particular peace of a man who has heard something true from someone he trusts completely. "All right," he said. Walt Greer went home shortly after, and he told Martha that evening that he had watched something in that kitchen between Thomas and Clara, that he didn't entirely have words for something about the way they looked at each other when the hard thing was said the way neither of them looked away. Martha told him that was what it looked like when two people had actually built something together, rather than just ended up in the same place, and Walt said he reckoned that was right. The twist came in February from a direction no one had anticipated. Helen Vance appeared at the homestead on a Tuesday afternoon, not with her usual purposeful efficiency, but with a look on her face that Clara read immediately as "I have something important, and I am not sure how you will receive it." She sat down at the kitchen table, and she accepted coffee, and she looked at Thomas and Clara and said, "I've been asked to tell you something, and I want to say first that I debated whether to tell you at all, because you don't need this, and you've been through enough." "Tell us," Clara said. Helen set down her coffee. "Richard Caldwell came to see me last week," she said. "He came to my home, which he has not done in the 11 years I have chaired the Land Affairs Committee, and he sat in my parlor, and he told me that he wants to make a formal apology to the Whitaker homestead." The kitchen was completely silent. Thomas said very carefully, "He wants to what?" "He's retained new counsel," Helen said. "Someone not connected to Marsh or the Denver firms. And his new counsel has advised him rather forcefully, by Helen's account, that the territorial board's review of his acquisition history is more serious than he initially understood, and that his position is materially improved by demonstrating cooperative good faith with the properties he targeted. "It's strategic," Clara said. "Entirely," Helen agreed. "I am not presenting it as anything else." His new lawyer told him that a formal acknowledgement of the harm caused to this property, combined with a financial settlement, would likely keep his name off any future criminal referrals. "How much?" Thomas said. Helen named a number. It was enough to retire the remaining loan balance in full, with enough left over to fund the spring planting and the coop expansion Clara had been deferring. Thomas looked at Clara. Clara looked at Thomas. Something passed between them that was not simple. It had layers. The way everything real has layers, and the top layer was practical calculation, and underneath it was the question of what it meant to take money from a man who had tried to destroy them. And underneath that was something older and more complicated about what justice looked like when it came in a form you hadn't asked for. "What do you think?" Thomas asked her. He asked her the way he asked her everything now, not seeking permission, not delegating, but genuinely wanting her answer, because he valued it. She thought about it honestly, the way she thought about hard things, looking at it directly, without flinching, without pretending it was simpler than it was. "I think Caldwell is protecting himself," she said. "I think his new lawyer is right, that it improves his position. I think accepting money from him is not the same as forgiving him, and it doesn't mean what he did was acceptable." She paused. "I think Eleanor Whitaker's chickens deserve a proper expansion, and the spring planting deserves proper funding, and the debt that was caused in part by 2 years of Caldwell's interference deserves to be cleared by Caldwell's money." She looked at Thomas. "I think we should take it." Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then, "Yeah," he said. "I think so too." Helen Vance left with their answer and returned 2 weeks later with the paperwork which Aldridge reviewed and found entirely in order, and which Clara and Thomas signed at the kitchen table on a Saturday morning in February, with the sound of the chickens coming through the window and the light coming through at the angle it came through in February, which was different from the July light that had been in that kitchen the first evening. Clara sat at this table and made Thomas hand over the foreclosure letters. The loan was paid off on a Wednesday in early March. Aldridge brought the discharge notice himself because he said some things were worth the ride, and he was right. He handed the paper to Thomas, who handed it immediately to Clara, because that was the order that felt right to both of them, without discussion. She read it. Discharge in full. No further encumbrance. Property held free and clear. She folded it carefully. She stood up. She walked to the desk, Eleanor's desk, where Eleanor's careful handwriting still labeled the folders inside, and she opened the top drawer, and she placed the discharge notice in the front of it, where it would be the first thing seen. Thomas watched her do it. "That's where the foreclosure letters were," he said. "I know," she said. "Different papers now." Spring came. The way springs came in Colorado. Reluctant at first, the cold fighting the warmth for 2 weeks before the warmth won, and the ground softened and the light changed, and the world that had been brown and white became something else. The winter wheat came up in the east field in long green rows that Thomas walked every morning at first light with the look of a man watching something he had stopped believing in come back to life. The chicken flock hit 30 hens. The garden went in on schedule. The supply contracts were renewed, expanded, and in 2 cases, the Millbrook Hotel and Helen Vance's auxiliary renegotiated at better terms, because the Homestead's reputation had grown enough over the winter that the buyers came to Clara rather than the other way around. On a morning in April, the first warm morning that genuinely felt like a promise kept, Thomas and Clara stood at the edge of the east field and looked at the wheat coming up, and the fence line that had been built right and would stay right, and the barn that was no longer bowing on the west wall because they had repaired it in October, and the house that still needed paint but had a new coat planned for May. "My neighbor Bill Calloway came by yesterday," Thomas said. "While you were in town?" "I didn't know he stopped by," she said. "He said he heard we'd paid off the note," Thomas said. "He wanted to know how we did it." He paused. I told him I put an advertisement in the paper. Clara looked at him. He was looking straight ahead at the wheat field, but there was something at the corner of his mouth that was working toward a smile, and not quite making it yet. And what did Bill Calloway say to that? She said. He said he might know some men in similar situations, Thomas said, and asked if I knew where they might find a woman like you. Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, What did you tell him? I told him there wasn't a woman like you, Thomas said. There's only you. He turned and looked at her fully. I told him that, and I meant it. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked back at the wheat field, at the green rows coming up straight and true from the ground she had helped turn and seed and tend through a hard winter. She thought about the train platform in July, standing alone with 2 bags and a name on a piece of paper and the full weight of everything she had survived pressing down on her. She thought about walking 4 miles in the heat. She thought about the foreclosure letters face down on the flour-dusted table. She thought about Richard Caldwell's careful eyes, and Henderson's careful words, and Aldridge's reading glasses, and Helen Vance's particular smile. She thought about Thomas's hand over hers at the kitchen table that first time, brief and unplanned, and everything that had grown from that moment, the way wheat grows from seed slowly with work, and then suddenly, and then undeniably. She had come to Colorado because she needed a place and had nothing left to lose. She had stayed because the place needed her, and she was made for exactly this kind of work. And somewhere between those two things, between need and purpose, between arriving and belonging, she had found something she had not known she was still looking for. A home that was truly hers. A man who saw her truly. A piece of ground that bore the mark of her hands and would keep bearing it long after she was gone. Thomas, she said. Yeah. I'm going to need 2 more roosters by fall if we want to hit 40 hens by spring. He laughed that full, unguarded laugh that she had first heard on courthouse steps, and that she intended to spend the rest of her life finding reasons to hear again. I'll look into it, he said. She took his hand. They stood there together in the April morning, in the field that was coming back on the land that was theirs, fully, legally, permanently theirs. And Clara Bennett Whitaker felt from the ground up through her boots and into her chest and all the way to the top of her, the solid and absolute certainty of a woman who had fought for the right thing and won it, and would spend every day going forward making sure it was worth the fight. She had come to tend chickens. She had built a life. She had saved a ranch and married an honest man and turned a forgotten homestead on the Colorado frontier into something that would outlast every person who had ever doubted it could be done. And she had done it the only way she knew how, by showing up, by seeing clearly, by refusing to quit, and by understanding in her bones the one truth that the frontier had always taught to anyone willing to learn it, that a person is not measured by what they are given, but by what they are willing to build, and that the woman willing to build is never ever as small as the world tries to make her.